It looked to be a pretty standard missing hiker op. The guy was fit, healthy, and experienced, and he knew how to read a map, and he carried the actual equipment necessary with him. And we figured that we'd find him within the first 24 hours or so, most likely with some kind of injury, and we did find him all right, just not in any kind of state that we figured we would. And to this day, just thinking about it can send a shiver or two up my own spine. By the time we launched the rescue op in earnest, Robert had been missing for coming up on 72 hours. The weather had turned wet, and while the rain wasn't all that bad, the mud up near Black Ridge was ankle deep in parts, the kind that tries to pull your whole damn boots off. Now, we started at the trailhead where his truck was still parked and then fanned out as far and wide as we could to cover the most possible ground. And like I said, we were really hopeful given the circumstances, but all we found that first day were just boot prints of the same brand that Robert wore. That was obviously great news because it meant that we had a trail, right? But Jesus, what that trail led us to is something obviously I'll never forget. And the second day, we came to sections of boot prints that had been washed out by the rain, meaning accurately tracking Robert's movements was getting harder and harder. But then, one of the dog teams hit on something. About 2 miles in, we found Robert's water bottle just sitting off the side of the trail like he'd set it down and forgotten to pick it back up again. Now, there was still a little water in it too. Not a lot, but not so little a person might abandon it. And I guess that looking back on it, that's probably the point that we should have realized that things weren't as they seemed. A few miles away from the bottle, we found one of Robert's gloves, and then not far away from there, the other glove. And that's when it really hit that something was wrong and he most likely wasn't himself. But leaving things behind like that in what could have been an orderly fashion, it also suggested that he might be leading us someplace. One of our team suggested that something might have been pursuing him out of the area he knew that we might search, and so while that shedding gear behavior was definitely the first red flag that we spotted, no one automatically assumed the worst. So we kept on following the trail of scattered gear until we came to the next thing, his pack. It had been dumped in this thicket, the contents spilled out on the ground beside it, and after fishing it out, we saw the straps had been cut. Now, why he'd do something like that was completely beyond us, and the only thing that came to mind was way too creepy to even entertain. One of the guys said it was like something had grabbed him by the pack while he was still wearing it. If it was something big enough, like a bear or maybe even a mountain lion, it made sense that he'd have to cut through his straps to free himself. But there was no sign of any struggle, no blood or viscera to suggest that there had been an attack. And it was while we were scratching our heads over that little mystery that someone called us over to where the bag had been found. And like I mentioned, a bunch of its contents had spilled out, apparently after being tossed into the bushes. There were food items, a notebook, and some items of clothing, but each and every one showed signs that our missing hiker was not of sound mind. First off, all of the food left behind had been tampered with, and by that I mean Robert appeared to have opened and taken a bite out of each item before abandoning it, with some items, such as these individually packaged granola bars, looking like Robert had bitten through the packaging. Now I know what you're probably thinking. Couldn't an animal have come along and bitten through the packaging as well? And while that'd be a great question, the bite pattern showed that it must have been a human. Maybe not Robert himself, but definitely a human being. And then, seeing as we were in such a remote area, the chances of it not being Robert were basically slim to none. And then, there was the matter of Robert's notebook. Based on the first half of what had been written, it was clear that Robert had been using it as some kind of trail diary. There were entries of Maple Loop and Diablo Lake, but then as we got into the section which detailed the hike Robert had disappeared on, that's where things got weird. He'd written sentences that stopped halfway through, and then he'd just move on to the next like the previous was finished and made total sense. The handwriting got progressively worse too, to the point that we could barely make out any of the words. The last entry was little more than looping scribbles with only words like lights, moving, or trees being legible. And then there was this one part, something about being watched from the rocks, that sent an actual chill down my spine when I came across the sentence. Robert was clearly in a bad way, and we'd gone from expecting to find a warm body in around 24 hours to wondering if we were ever going to find him at all, especially after we found his boots. We came across both of them, laced, untied, with socks stuffed in them, sitting all neatly on a rock. And there was a sort of calmness about how they'd been displayed, an order to it, like Robert wasn't crazy at all. But to walk away from them, to just keep on walking through the woods with, from what we could tell, no footwear to speak of, we knew right there that he'd probably lost his mind. A couple of guys stayed behind to bag up all of Robert's belongings for the benefit of the county sheriff, and the rest of us kept moving, and less than a mile away, we started to find the rest of Robert's clothing. We found the shirt first, buttons were ripped, and then the pants, and his underwear last. All were in a rough line heading off trail towards some limestone outcropping. Now, Command figured that there was a chance that he'd been hypothermic and had stripped off of his clothes in that classic paradox of feeling warm when you're actually dying. It happens more than people think, and it doesn't make it any less concerning, but it's true that it's not totally uncommon. And so as we approached that sort of limestone, we widened the grid and said a little prayer that we'd find Robert alive. We had the chopper in the air on day 5, and once the weather was clear enough. We try not to put too much faith in the crew, purely to preserve our own sanity. But then that afternoon, they got a sighting way up near that outcrop that I mentioned. The crew had spotted someone up near the outcrop moving near the mouth of the cave system up on the north face. They seemed to be sure it was Robert. And when our team leader asked why over the radio, they pretty much came back with, "Because the guy's naked." And that lifted our spirits a little, knowing that he was alive, but the fact that he seemed to be hanging out in the cave system filled us with dread. And this is why. Now, according to the rangers that we liaise with, Robert had been spotted near some old solution caves, as they're called. And these are the most common sort of cave there is and are formed by acidic groundwater, meaning some damp caverns are way bigger than others, and there are plenty of smaller passageways that a person could get stuck in, especially should they panic and get themselves lost. Ariel put eyes on a figure crawling inside, the body very pale against the dark rock. And so if Robert had lost his mind, we knew that we had to get to him before he got himself lost, stuck, or worse. And I was on the team that went in. There were 4 of us, all equipped with headlamps, radios that half worked underground, and all of our important ropes. I remember how cold and damp the air was, and how there was this sort of metallic smell. Something like rusted iron, really, and cave systems aren't known for smelling great or anything like that, but I never smelled one like that before. We called out Robert's name every 20 yards or so, and while the passageways and caverns were pretty wide to begin with, they started to gradually close in on us the further that we pushed on. And that's when we found even more signs of Robert's mental deterioration. There were smears of what looked to be mud on some of the walls, obviously fresh, as time and the damp would have washed them away had they not been put there recently. And there was also gouge marks in the softer limestone. 4 scrapes, then another 4, which someone had been scratching at the wall, and really hard too, using nothing but their fingers. There were longer scrape marks further down the tunnel where someone, most likely Robert, had pushed their fingernails into the wall before dragging them along. There was this little smear of blood on one of them, then one of the team looking down to point their headlamp at the ground, and there it was. One of Robert's fingernails had been torn off by a particular stubborn section of stone. And as we moved deeper, the passageway that we were in opened up into a low chamber, and that's when we first heard movement. There was a scuffling noise, and then the sound of unsteady breathing, and then all of our headlamps were on him at once. He was naked, and covered in mud and scratches with these long red lines down his arms and chest like he'd clawed at his own skin. His hair looked matted into these clumps, and his face was streaked with dirt. He looked like an animal, but of all the things that gave me the chills, even all this time later, it's Robert's eyes that topped that list. They didn't blink. He just stared with this look of anger on his face until one of us tried to ID him. Then he came at us, or at least what was left of him did. He didn't scream or shout, he just rushed at us in almost total silence, and the only sound being his heavy breathing. But the look on his face, and particularly in his eyes, like I mentioned, it was clear that he wanted to hurt us. A guy named Alan was closest to him, so that's who we went for first. Alan tried to steady himself and grab at him, but Robert slammed into him so hard, he knocked him into the wall so hard that his headlamp spun off and rolled away. And then as the beam of light coming from Alan's headlamp circled around us like this weird sort of disco ball, Robert sank his teeth into the flesh of Alan's forearm. Now, Alan was a tough guy. He'd been on maybe 20 or so SNR ops by that point, and he'd seen and been through a lot of crap. But the scream that he let out as Robert's teeth broke the skin of his arm, I've never heard a man so terrified in all my life. He was screaming, "Get him off me! Get him off me!" while Robert shook his head like a dog trying to tear meat from the bone. We had to apply pressure to both sides of his jaw, almost enough to break it before Alan was able to yank his arm away. And after that, it was a case of piling on and getting him restrained, but he fought us like a man possessed. He was thrashing, trying his absolute damnedest to bite at us, and he even started scraping his teeth against the rock for a second once we had him down. And it was me that had to jerk his head to the side and pin it so he couldn't do his teeth any serious damage. He was really strong for a guy who had been missing almost a week. He'd abandoned all of his food and water in the days before, but he must have been getting sustenance from somewhere, or he'd have never been able to fight us like he did. But from where? It was a struggle, but we got the cuffs and straps on him eventually. We carried them for psych cases, though we usually didn't use them, and after that, he just went limp for a while. He didn't pass out or anything, he just went quiet and stopped moving. Like his eyes were open while we were moving him, but he was just staring off at nothing, like he'd just given up all of a sudden. 3 of us hauled him out, with Alan close behind holding his bandaged arm, and he went straight to the medics on scene, who found deep punctures to his arm and then later to the hospital for some stitches and a tetanus shot. Robert was placed in a stretcher, wrapped in blankets, and then transported down the mountain. He never said a single word the whole way. He just laid there with his eyes wide open, staring up at nothing. I later heard that at one point the stretcher kind of jolted after it hit a root or something. One of the guys walking nearby cursed, something out of a scare anyways, and then they saw Robert smiling. They only saw it for a split second, just this flash of blood-stained teeth, and then it was gone, and his face was blank again. Now, from the hospital, we later heard that he was transferred to the state psych facility once they figured out what kind of state that he was in. They tested him for head trauma, drugs, all kinds of things, but the only explanation was a sort of acute psychotic break, meaning Robert just went out hiking one day, then spontaneously and completely lost his mind. He stayed mute for weeks and then started talking in fragments when they got him on meds. He said he didn't remember anything past a certain point on his hike, but he did remember attacking us. I heard Robert broke down in tears as the memories came back to him, and then when asked why he attacked us, all he said was that he remembered being confused and scared. He was convinced that we were there to kill him, and so he did the only thing he could think to do at the time and attempted to defend himself. I heard his family went to visit him at the hospital, and I heard it was bad. Robert's sister said that she could barely recognize him anymore, and it was like the boy that she'd grown up with and the man that he'd become were just gone. Doctors did their thing, put him through all kinds of tests and examinations, but they never did figure out what had caused his mental break. Something had to be written in his file, though, so the official explanation became survival-induced psychosis. But between you and me, that was just a rubber stamp so the authorities could close the book on it, and all without ever really digging into what happened to the guy. Man got lost, man panics, and then snaps from the sheer stress and isolation. The report barely even mentioned the bite. It just said Robert attacked the S&R team and that one of them required medical treatment. But to us, that didn't cover the extent of what happened at all. We never did get a full explanation. Robert's case got filed away with 1,000 others like it was no different from them. But let me tell you, if there ever was a case worthy of opening up a freaking X-file for S&R Ops, it was that one, because it was unlike any I'd ever been on before and any I went on after. My grandfather was a World War II vet. He had a bunch of medals and stuff from it too, but for the longest time, us kids only knew him as the quiet old guy who sat on the porch and smoked his pipe. Now, he didn't talk a whole lot about the war. Most of those fellas didn't. But every once in a while as we got older, usually after a couple of beers on Memorial Day or something like that, he'd open up a little and tell us a story or two. Now, he kept it all very PG-13 at first and kept the darker stories to himself. But then one Thanksgiving, after everyone else had retired and it was just me and him watching old movies, he told me one that he never told anyone before, let alone Grandma or my dad. And let me tell you, it'll be one that I remember for as long as I live, and I hope to share it with you. So, just a little backstory. Grandpa enlisted in 1942 after Pearl Harbor and ended up as a bosun's mate on a smaller vessel doing search and rescue work out in the Pacific. Now, it wasn't the glamorous stuff that you see in the movies, not by any stretch, but it was a very important job, because once they got word a ship had gone down, be it a merchantman, transport, destroyer, whatever they had hit, the enemy that is, he and his crew would go out looking for survivors. They'd be looking for rafts, lifeboats, guys floating in life jackets, and sometimes they'd find them, sometimes they wouldn't, because Lord knows there's a lot of empty ocean out there. It was a tough gig too. They had to worry about the heat, the salt, and the way that the sun beat down on everything until their eyes burned. And then there were the days that they came back empty-handed with nothing but the feeling that the sea had already claimed whoever they were looking for. But Grandpa said the toughest day of all came in early 1944, when they happened across something that can only really be described as a crime against humanity. Grandpa and his boys were out looking for the crew of a freighter that had been torpedoed somewhere east of the Marshalls. They searched the whole day, dawn until dusk, and came up Snake Eyes. But then on the way back, they suddenly spotted something on a beach on a little atoll that wasn't supposed to have anybody on it. And they decided to sail a little closer to get a clearer picture. And then after looking through the ship's telescope, they saw that it was a big piece of shipwreck, washed up right there on the shoreline. Now, they were under orders to investigate any potential signs of life, so even though the wreckage didn't appear to belong to the freighter that they were looking for, they diverted to go check it out. They make landfall, and then head into the jungle to go looking for survivors, and while they found people, they found them in unimaginable conditions, because it wasn't the crew of the freighter, but the survivors of a civilian transport that had gone down months earlier in the same general area. It was a passenger ship, so the survivors were a mixed bunch and included about a dozen families, some government folks, along with merchants trying to get somewhere safer. Apparently they got caught in a storm which had blown them way off course, and after hitting some rocks, some of the survivors washed up on that tiny little island that they were on. Grandpa said it was maybe half a mile long, coral and shrub, really nothing much, just rocks and thorns and the constant sound of the waves chewing at the edges. They had no radio, no real food beyond what they could scavenge, and their fresh water was limited to a couple brackish pools and whatever rain they could catch. Things were tough, and there were a lot of worried survivors, but we were told that there was also a kind of commonly shared hope that sooner or later they'd be found. And by the time my grandpa's boat got there, things had gone bad, really bad, worse than anyone could make sense of at first. We were told that around 70 people survived the wreck and successfully made it to the island without drowning in the surf. But by the time my grandpa showed up, there were no more than 40. Some died as a result of injuries sustained in the wreck, and some of the weaker ones just gave out from thirst and heat. But not everyone died that way. The ones my grandpa found had broken off into something that wasn't a group of survivors anymore. It was more like a tribe. a brutal little kingdom built out of desperation and a complete lack of hope. Apparently, there came a point where some survivors realized that they were too far off course for the search parties to find them, meaning that they had to just wait to get lucky. It turns out the probability was way higher than they thought because obviously they only spent a few months on the island before they were found. But I guess at some point they worked themselves up into such a frenzy of despair that they ended up losing all hope of being found, and that's when things got really bad. After a brief power struggle, it was the stronger ones, mostly the younger men, who took over completely. At first, they did it through controlling drinking water, but they expanded by gaining control of the hunting and foraging that went on, meaning people either worked for them or they didn't eat. And this was all done in the name of survival, of course, with the new elites claiming everything was for the benefit of the collective, but the only people who seemed to benefit were them. The island's workforce was mostly women, kids, and older folks, and it was them that did all the gathering and the foraging and most of the fishing, too. The younger men either hunted wild pigs, which they were apparently very successful at, or sat around drinking liquor that they made out of coconut water or something. I never quite got the details on that or how they did it. But having them all drunk all the time meant that if someone below their station talked back or even tried to take more than their share, they got beaten. Or sometimes they got worse, which also explained why there were only around 40 survivors instead of the full original complement of 70. Grandpa said he and his buddies could see the hierarchy among the survivors the second they found them. The ones in charge sat in the shade of the only real trees, looking thin and mean-eyed, while the others moved like they were already half ghosts. Some of the survivors just about lost their minds with joy when they spotted a bunch of Americans, but Grandpa said the scene was still anything but happy. He remembered how broken everyone seemed, how they cried, but he also said that he remembered the stench. Not just the usual island rot or the salt, but something heavier, like fear, unwashed bodies, and old blood, all mixed up to something far more terrible than the individual parts. Some of the survivors looked at the landing party like they weren't sure if the sailors were real or just some kind of hallucinations. No crying, no questions, just sort of watching. Grandpa said that he didn't understand why at first, that he thought everyone would be happy to see them. But after he and his boys pieced everything together, their muted reactions started making a horrible kind of sense. They were told that any kind of conflict between survivors was settled with fists, and if the grievance was big enough, whatever sharp piece of coral or driftwood was handy. About a dozen people died that way, murdered in what were basically these gladiatorial fights that everyone gathered around to watch under pain of death. Grandpa said he saw the survivor of one of those fights, lying in the shade of a tree just waiting to die with his wife and one surviving kid kneeling near him. His bruises up and down his broken ribs had gone red and swollen from where infection was settling in, and he had cuts that hadn't healed right and were still weeping. There was also a couple of men who had some real bad limps from legs that had been broken and never set, but Grandpa was told the breaks had been inflicted as punishments for stealing food. Now, one of the survivors later told them that two of the original group had been killed in fights over the water supply early on. One strangled the other to death, but the dead man hit his opponent so hard over the head with a rock that he died less than a day later. Another man had been left out in the open sun for a full day as punishment for stealing a handful of fish, and he didn't make it through the night after that. All of their bodies were just pushed out into the lagoon for the sharks and the tide. Overall, Grandpa said it was the women who had it the worst. To him, it seemed like they were seen more like property than people by those in charge. And it makes my skin crawl to write this, but they got shared around among the ones in charge like tools or rations. Any man who tried to protect his wife or daughter got beaten until he couldn't stand, or worse, made to watch while the leaders reminded everyone who held the power. He said one of the older men had tried to organize a kind of strike where the workers didn't work until conditions improved. They broke his hand so he couldn't work or fight, and then denied him water until he died. After that, nobody argued much. There was no law but the fist and the threat of being cut off from the only things that kept you alive. When Grandpa and his crew first came across the group of survivors, their quote-unquote leaders tried to play it like they were just survivors holding things together, doing what they had to do. Grandpa was later told about one of them who tried explaining the terrible conditions with the excuse that it was what people needed. He talked about how they'd only been so brutal to keep order and how the weak had to make way so the strong can survive. He tried to make out that they were the good guys, but Grandpa and his boys saw the fear in the eyes of the others, the way people flinched when certain men raised their voices. One of the women managed to whisper something to a corpsman while they were checking her over. Something about how the younger men decided who lived and who didn't when the water got low. And that was all it took for sailors to start asking questions, and the whole rotten setup started coming out in pieces. Accusations, names, stories that made the hair on your arm stand up even in that heat. And it didn't end quietly. 3 of those self-appointed bosses decided that they weren't going to give up control, and one of them, who had a knife made of sharpened metal taken from the wreckage of their boats, straight up attacked them. Grandpa was right there when it happened, and said the fight was as short as it was ugly. The man came at one of the sailors swinging, screaming that the island was theirs now and that no one had the right to take it away from them. They had to shoot the guy with the knife, and then as he went down, another charged them, and so he was shot dead too. The third tried to grab a woman and drag her off into the jungle to do God knows what to her, but he was pursued, surrounded, and then talked into giving himself up before anyone else got hurt. Once all the leaders were detained or dead, the rest of the survivors went through a kind of emotional collapse. Some started crying, and not like soft weeping either. Grandpa said that they were loud, broken sounds that sounded like they were being held in for weeks at that point. Others just stared at the ground completely empty, like all that violence at the end had burned what little humanity they had left in them. Now, a few of the stronger ones who hadn't been part of that sadistic ruling class helped the survivors get everybody up and onto the boats. More had turned up to help ferry the survivors, and they too couldn't believe what they were seeing. There also wasn't enough room for certain families to travel together, and thanks to the language barrier, it was hard to explain that they were being separated. Some refused to let go of each other and even tried fighting us when we tried prying them apart, but somehow, and thankfully, some kind of communication was established and things calmed down enough for the evacuation to commence. The survivors ended up being taken to a hospital ship. There, they were found to be severely dehydrated, with infected wounds and broken bones that had set wrong, and that was just the physical damage. The psychological damage was a whole other mess entirely. Grandpa said a few of them seemed like they weren't coming back from it. They were the ones who had nightmares about the island, who woke up in their hospital beds in the middle of the night thinking that they were still there and they could never escape it. One guy used to cry almost constantly, saying in broken English how the weak ones were left for the sun, and the rest acted like the sailors taking care of them were just as bad as the elites on the island, and even the politest interaction seemed to imply the threat of violence to them. He said the Navy ended up classifying a lot of the details, so the only info on the island spread by word of mouth, and even then it only spread through whispers and rumor. They made it sound like a standard rescue op to recover storm survivors. Officially, the ones who died in the fighting were listed as Japanese-aligned enemy combatants, which meant that there was never any formal investigation into their deaths like there would be for any other civilian. Once they'd been treated, and all made recoveries full, the survivors were scattered to different places. Not their countries of origin either, just the closest convenient ports. And so even after all that, they still had to struggle to make it home once the war was over. At least that's what Grandpa assumed happened, and they didn't just decide to make their homes elsewhere. I guess I'm not great with the details on this, but you can't blame me. Grandpa only ever told me the story probably one time. He said it stayed with him more than anything else, because while war was one thing, it was something else to see people having turned into something less than human, and all because they simply run out of hope. He never mentioned the island again, but he often remarked on how thin that civilized line was and how quick it could disappear. I think about it sometimes when people talk about how civilized we all are. Grandpa would just shake his head, said the ocean doesn't care about civilization, and neither does a man who decides the only law left is the one he can enforce, with his fists. People ask me all the time what's the worst call I ever worked, and most of them expect some story about a kid who fell through ice or a hiker who just gave out from exposure. Now don't get me wrong, those can be bad. In fact, anything which involves kids ends up coming back to visit you late at night when the mind's not quite as strong as it is during the daylight. But one that sticks with me even more than the others was what happened to those 3 campers up in the Rockies during the autumn of '99. I was on the county search and rescue team by then, and I've been out of the army for about 6 years at this point. I did 1 tour of Iraq, 2 tours of Afghanistan, and then decided 3 tours would do me just fine, and separated. I tried doing some private security stuff after, just to pad that little nest egg that I had left over from the military. But that felt like I was wearing down my luck a little too thin, so I quit, shopped around for a while, and then settled on search and rescue. Now it seems simple. You go out, you find people, you bring them home. Now most days that's exactly what happens, and even on the days that it didn't, it was better than getting shot at. But then with this Rockies operation back in 1999, while the search itself was pretty simple, the aftermath has stayed with me ever since. Now the call came late one afternoon saying 3 guys in their 20s, I think they were college buddies, had failed to check in after their weekend of hiking and camping. Now, the cars were still parked at the entrance to the trail with no notes or anything slid under the wipers. And then since the weather was good, we expected to find them relatively quickly. Unless, of course, something had gone horribly wrong, which it had. Now, we staged at the trailhead that evening, got the dogs out, waited for volunteers, the whole circus. And then I was assigned the primary search grid along with 2 other guys that I'd worked with for years by then. And like I said, we were confident that we'd find our missing hikers, and we found one of them that very next morning. He just wasn't anywhere near the condition that we were hoping for. We found him about 4 miles in, sitting on a rock beside a lake like he was just out there waiting for us to find him. And I guess everyone's waiting to be found in that kind of situation, so let me elaborate. When we find people, their reaction is usually along the lines of, "Oh my God, thank you so much." They cry, they laugh, heck, sometimes they pass out with exhaustion and from knowing that they were finally saved. But this guy, Rob or Bob I think his name was, he just raised a hand very slow-like and sort of something similar to a kid in a classroom saying, "Present" or "Here." And I guess it had to be in his early 20s, clean-shaven with his clothes a little dirty but not completely torn up. He didn't have any injuries, but he didn't look great, and he was just sitting there staring at the water. But above all else, I remember his face more than I remember his name or what he was wearing. The first thing that hit me was how calm he was. Like I said, people get super emotional, but there was Rob or Bob just looking like we'd walked in on his coffee break. We asked where his buddies were, these 2 guys named Mark and Ben, but Rob said he had no idea. That he just woke up one morning and found both of their tents were just empty. There were no tracks leading away that he could see, no gear missing except what they were wearing, and so he went looking for them. Said he searched for hours too, just yelling until his voice gave out. It wasn't long before he was lost, and then when he realized it, he just stopped where he was and stayed put because he heard that that's what you're supposed to do. We tried to find his friends, and we worked the grids hard too. Dogs, drones even, ground teams, even a helicopter for aerial photography. But we found nothing, not even a scrap of clothing or so much as a footprint that didn't belong to Rob or us. And all the tents were still pitched in their original spots, sleeping bags rolled like each of the missing dudes had just stepped out for a piss. Their food was still there, their phones left behind with batteries completely drained, and it was like the 2 of them had been lifted straight out of their bags by a goddamn UFO or something. Now, Rob's story never changed. He gave the same details every time the detectives talked to him. He woke up alone, hadn't heard anything the night before. No arguing, no fighting, just poof, and they were gone. Now, way weirder stuff has happened to me, search and rescue and military, that I can't directly point to as weird, but this one had something about it, and not in a good way. It's not the setup that really bothers me. It's how Rob acted once we got him out of there. I've seen men after they'd taken a life, not in the Hollywood, hell yeah, brother, we got him kind of way, and not in that dumb, oh God, what have I done kind of way either. That's total fakery too. It's something quiet, kind of intangible and unmistakably heavy all at once. And it's like it sits on a person and hangs over them like a dark cloud you can see long before you take a look into their eyes. There's that seen too much look in the eyes, a voice that's just a little too steady, and then these rehearsed answers a person falls back on because they don't want to think about what they just did. And Rob had that exact way about him. He sat on that rock, arms were folded, describing how his two best friends had vanished into thin air, and there wasn't a single crack in the delivery. No tears, no I should have done something, just the facts, like he'd practiced reeling them off. I mentioned it to the lead detective later and told him the only time that I'd seen a man act like that was after he'd done something permanent to another human being, like what was done, and he was already living with the psychological consequences. The guy nodded and said that he'd look into it, and for a while there, I hoped that there was something to it and I wasn't just being paranoid. But Rob had a clean background, no history of violence, and there certainly hadn't been any insurance policies taken out on the two missing guys. Now, what with them being fairly young and fitter and healthier than the average. And on top of that, they found no blood, no signs of any struggle, nothing like that, and it really was like the two guys just vanished from the face of the earth. Eventually, the search scaled back, and officially speaking, Mark and Ben are still missing, but unofficially, I don't think anything but their remains are going to be found, and probably not anytime soon either. Rob walked out of the hospital the next day. He gave a couple of statements, thanked us for finding them, and then that was that. The world just moved on like there was nothing at all wrong with Rob's supposed lack of knowledge. Last I heard, he moved out of state, and it seems crazy, but he was never charged with a single thing. No bodies, no evidence, just a story that didn't add up, and a demeanor that, if you knew what you were looking for, stank to high heaven. Crazy things happen in the woods, I know that all too well, but two grown men don't just evaporate in the middle of the night, and a guy who supposedly spent a day and night alone, terrified his friends are hurt or dead, doesn't sit on a rock looking like he's already made peace with whatever happened. I've pulled people out of way worse situations who still had fight left in them. Some of them even demanded to help search for their friends, but there was Rob, looking like he'd already checked out. And above all the other things, I remember that look in his eyes, that calm, like the hard part was already over. I used to volunteer with Seattle Mountain Rescue back in the 80s, and my HQ was up in the Cascade foothills outside of some little logging town in Washington. I was mostly volunteers back then, with the team made up of a bunch of us who knew the woods from hunting, fishing, or just living out that way. I was in my late 20s at the time and worked construction during the week, but when a call came in for a missing kid, we dropped everything and came running to the rescue. In my 5 years volunteering, I worked more than 300 S&R operations in total, and every single one of them is memorable. Most are memorable because we found our missing people, brought them home, and saved the day. But some are memorable for all the wrong reasons, like this one I'm about to tell you about right now. The girl's name was Lisa. She was 14 years old when she went missing, and she was last seen walking home from school on a Tuesday afternoon. Her usual route took her down about 3 miles of gravel road and then a stretch of trail that cut through the trees to her folks' place. Then, since it's not often someone gets lost on an open stretch of road, gravel or no gravel, we mustered up on the trailhead around dusk. Now, the sun was going down early that time of year as it was October, so we moved as fast as we could, mostly with just the standard stuff at first, like grid searches, looking for footprints, or anything that she might have dropped, along with the really old school stuff like just calling out her name. We had a little daylight to work with at first, but it wasn't long before it was full dark and no stars. About an hour in, fog was starting to settle in these low spots. I was on the ground team with 3 other guys, and we'd been out maybe 2 hours when I first noticed him. Now, at first, he was just this figure off to the side of the search line, standing in the trees maybe 80 yards out. He had a dark coat, dark pants, and a baseball cap on, and he was just sort of standing there, watching us. I shone my flashlight that way, and he stepped back into the shadows like he didn't want to be seen. And while that might ring alarm bells for a lot of you, it's actually not all that rare. You sometimes get locals who hear about a search and they'll drive over to start rubbernecking. Some do it out of malice, convinced that we're not doing our jobs right. Others do it just because they're curious and even try to volunteer sometimes. But this guy, he stayed way back. I called over to the team leader on the radio and said that there was some dude watching us. He radioed back to keep an eye on him, but otherwise stay on task. Now, as always, the missing kid came first. We kept on working and moving from place to place, but every time we'd shift the line or circle back toward the road, there he'd be again, still tracking parallel to us. Not helping, not calling out the girl's name, just watching us, all quiet. Now, once when we stopped to rest and pass around the thermos of coffee, I saw him closer, maybe 40 yards that time. His face looked strange under that cap, and I'm not trying to make out that I saw it coming or anything, but he sure did give me the creeps the time that I saw him closer. One of the older guys, Pete, muttered something about damn ghoul journalists, and we all laughed a little, in the way you do when you just shake it off. It hadn't occurred to me that he might have been a local journalist who wanted to write a story on the girl's disappearance. But as it turned out, Pete was wrong on that one. Dead wrong. By midnight, the ground search was winding down for the night, and we'd still found no sign of her. We set up a base camp near the trailhead with generators and lights and tried not to put all of our hope into the aerial unit, which was supposed to come in at first light if the weather held. Now, I remember I was on overnight watch rotation, just keeping the radios hot and the coffee going, and then around 2 in the morning, I stepped out to take a leak, and there he was again. He was further down the road this time, standing by the tree line under a streetlight that barely cut through the fog, and once again it looked like he was just observing us. I was tired and in no mood for him by then, and so I yelled out, asking if he needed something in that sort of passive-aggressive, loud kind of way. I thought he might try to explain himself, especially if he was a reporter or something, but he just turned and walked off into the dark without a word. I told the deputy on scene, and he said that he'd keep an eye out, but we both knew resources were thin. Morning came, and since the weather held, Ariel went up at around 7. They were doing expanded circles, looking for stuff like clothing or movement or disturbed ground. Then about an hour in, the pilot radioed that they'd spotted a man walking a ridge about 2 miles east of the search area, one with almost the exact same description to the guy who'd been shadowing our search. Dark coat, dark pants, baseball cap. They tracked him for a while from the air, and he looked at them a bunch of times to show that same pale face as he walked through the brush. Ariel then said that he reached a gravel road, turned down it, and then walked until we reached some isolated property a few miles down. The crew said it was this old 2-story place with peeling paint and no neighbors for at least half a mile, and then after watching him go inside, he hadn't come out again. Now, that was enough for the sheriff's office to get a warrant signed by a judge, and then as soon as the paperwork came through, they dispatched 2 of their deputies to go check it out. I was still at the command post when the call came over the radio that they were at the house, and from what I heard later, and from the after-action talk as well, the guy who answered the door seemed perfectly calm and perfectly reasonable. They asked why he'd been shadowing the search, and he gave some once again, an acceptable answer about having heard that there was a missing girl and wanting to help. The deputies asked why he'd acted so skittish, such as walking off into the dark when I called out to him, but he said he just didn't want to get in the way. I heard that both deputies figured that it was probably a false alarm, but seeing as safe is always better than sorry, they asked if they could take a look inside and the guy said sure. The deputies followed him into his kitchen, said the place was kind of cluttered too, dirty dishes, old stacks of newspapers, empty cans of ham that would have had flies buzzing around them in the summertime. One deputy was talking to him, the other was looking around, and then out of the blue, the guy just moved. He lunged for a drawer, pulled out a pistol, and then opened fire on each of the deputies from point blank. The first shot hit one deputy in the shoulder and spun him around like a top. The other deputy threw himself back to avoid the guy's shots, then drew and returned fire. I heard at least 4 of the deputies' 5 shots rip through our guy, sending him back against some cabinets with a crash and then down onto the floor with some big thud. And with his wounded coworker lying on the kitchen floor, the deputy that shot the guy went about clearing the house before he called for backup and medical. And he then went about treating the wounded man's injuries, and then there was something he noticed during that clearance. The basement door was locked from the outside with a padlock, and when the cops came to open it, they heard something faint coming downstairs, something like metal on metal. They forced the door, went down into the dark with their flashlights, and that's where they found her. Lisa, the girl we'd been looking for, chained by the ankle to a pipe in the corner of this unfinished cellar. The guy had turned it into a prison cell. Concrete floor, bare bulb that barely worked, mattress that looked like it had been down there a long time. She was alive, thank God, but was scared out of her mind, and I heard she didn't start really calming down again until her mom and dad arrived at that staging area to come get her. She was half-starved and severely dehydrated, but by some miracle, she hadn't been, well, let's just say she was intact enough that the doctors said that she'd recover physically. Mentally, I don't know how any young woman could get over something like that, but time heals all wounds, I suppose. We never got the full details on exactly how long he'd had her or what he had planned. The house had no other kids' clothes or toys, just tools and that chain that looked like it came off of a logging site. But whatever he had planned, thank God we got to him before he put it into action, you know? I didn't see the inside of the house myself. SAR doesn't do that once it turns criminal. But I heard the radio traffic and saw the ambulance leave with Lisa and the wounded deputy. And then later that day, when the debrief came around, there was a huge pile-in because everyone wanted to know what the heck the cops found up there. The guy they shot had no record to speak of. He was apparently just a quiet, lonely guy who worked odd jobs and lived out there alone. Neighbors said that he kept to himself and that he sometimes walked the woods at odd hours, and no one had any idea why he liked doing that, but I guess the whole incident with Lisa let people know that there had been a sort of quiet monster living among them. If Ariel hadn't spotted him heading home that morning, well, I don't like to think about it. Another day or two, and who knows, maybe we would have found her body. Lisa's poor family moved away not long after, and then, from what I heard, the house was boarded up and torn down years later.
On today's episode, you'll hear 3 disturbing roommate stories. One man is forced to spy on his housemate for dangerous criminals. Another discovers his roommate's disturbing obsession with things that'll leave your stomach churning. And one tenant begins waking up in the middle of the night to a sleepwalking roommate whose escalating behavior becomes too much to handle. Hear all of these terrifying tales right now, only on Let's Read.
Hey Joel, my name's Phil and I grew up in Tacoma, Washington in the 80s and 90s. Now I didn't do great in school, so I dropped out when I was 17 and got a job working in a bar to get myself some money. I stuck around for about 6 years learning all the tricks of the trade. And then by 2006, I was practically running the place under the guidance of the old owner/manager. That place was my meal ticket, so I ran a tight ship. And if you ask me, we had the best bar in South Tacoma. Well, it turns out someone else thought so too, and that someone ended up making me a job offer I couldn't refuse. It's not there anymore, but there was this restaurant in South Lake Union called Gastropod. And the guy I served drinks to that night was the owner, and he wanted me to be the place's new general manager once the current one turned over his keys at the end of the month. And he was willing to pay me very handsomely for my services. I said thank you and goodbye to the old crew, moved up to Seattle towards the end of the month, and then spent the next few works getting over the imposter syndrome as I settled into my new role. Now, I love my job, but the best thing about moving up to Seattle by far was my new apartment. Aside from the steep rent, there was basically no downsides to living there. It was a really nice neighborhood, and when I say it was quiet, I mean it was crazy just how peaceful it was. And that was in no small part down to my roommate, named Adam. And Adam was, in a word, a ghost. It actually took a whole 3 weeks after moving in before I met him, and I tried knocking on his door down in the lobby a whole 3 times and got no answer every single time. I was just getting home from work around 11:30 at night when I ran into Adam in the lobby while he was headed out. And the dude looked legitimately spooked to see me at first, and then even after I introduced myself as his new neighbor, he didn't seem to warm up at all. He wasn't rude really, just anxious. And after he said he worked in tech, I invited him up for a beer sometime, and he replied very nervously saying, "Yeah, sure, maybe," in a way that suggested that he was never going to do that. But hey, there are worse things than a quiet roommate, right? So I wasn't really complaining. And I lived in Seattle for a whole 6 months without anything to complain about, besides the rain, of course. Until one day, when my awesome brand new life turned into a complete nightmare. It started towards the end of March 2007. I finished up at work, said goodbye to everyone, and locked up for the night, and then as I was walking along waiting for a vacant cab to appear, a black sedan with tinted windows rolled up next to me. I could spend like a paragraph or two describing the guy who appeared in the open back window, but nothing really sums him up better than Fat Bill Burr. He was bald like Bill, he talked like Bill, and he even laughed like Bill, and the only difference was the guy in the back seat must have had at least 60 pounds on him. In this loud Boston accent, he says to me, "Hey buddy, how's it going?" I told him fine, that I was on my way home, and then he says, "Well, why don't you jump in? I'll give you a ride." I told the guy that I'd rather wait for a cab, and then he responds, "You're the manager of that gastropod place, right?" When I said yes, he told me that that was what he wanted to talk to me about, and if I got into his car and went for a ride with him, I might just find myself looking at a very lucrative money-making opportunity, both for me and the restaurant. I hesitated, but he gave me this look and said, "Come on. What do you think I'm gonna do? Just get in, and even if it's a no on what I gotta say, you got yourself a free ride home." Now, I wasn't some nerd incapable of defending myself, so I got in, and we took off, and I listened to what he had to say. But from the moment he started talking, I knew that I'd made a huge mistake. Now, the first thing he said was basically, "Alright, I'm gonna come clean. I don't give a crap about your crummy job, but you're in the car now, so shut up and listen." The guy's demeanor shifted completely after I got in the car, and I can't lie. It definitely made me a little nervous when he forcibly told me to shut up. And it wasn't just him and a driver either. There was a guy in the passenger seat looking around and very much mean-mugging me. And the guy started off by saying that since he knew where I lived and he knew where I worked, we'd be seeing plenty of each other in the future. And there was no point hiding or any of that crap, as he put it. But if I kept cool and did my job, then, like he said, there was money in it for me. All I had to do was find a way of getting into my roommate's part of the house so I could look for something for him. It was real small, and so small that he might be able to hide it in some pretty creative places, so I'd have to look long and hard if I wanted to find it. But when I did find it, the guy didn't want me to take it. He just wanted me to let him know that it was there and, more importantly, where it was being hidden. Now, I remember kind of reflexively saying, "I can't do that," to which he responded that not only could I do what he asked, but I would. He said I didn't look stupid, so he knew I'd do the right thing and do as he asked. I asked what would happen if I didn't, and the implications were clear. He said I'd recognize the thing he wanted me to find from the letters D-FNTL written on it. I didn't have to memorize it though. I don't even think it was those exact letters either, to be honest, but it'd be the only thing in his place with those letters on it, and then when I found it, all I had to do was tell him it was there. He left a kind of pause, waiting for me to say something, but all I could bring myself to ask was if he was, like, with the CIA or the FBI or something. The guy laughed and then told me if he was, he'd just arrest me and throw my ass in a cell, then threaten me with prison time till I cooperated. But since he wasn't, since he was a nice guy, as he put it, he was going to pay me to do it instead. On the other hand, he could make a phone call to some associates of his who'd head over to my place in the middle of the night and beat the location of the object out of my roommate. But he knew that it'd be noisy and messy and have the cops crawling around, and since I probably had my own stuff going on, I most likely didn't want that. Just to make it clear, I did not have my own stuff going on, and I'd have been more than happy to have gotten the cops involved there and then. But he had that whole thing covered with the next part of his little speech. He said the cops in Seattle were dumb and couldn't run a goddamn bath, let alone a city. And they were also more corrupt than an NBA ref, at least according to him anyway. And so if I talked to them and made any kind of report about him or what was going on with my roommate, he'd know, and there'd be trouble. Now by this point, I'm just a complete mess in my head, and all my energy was going towards not showing that. My head was spinning, I can feel myself sweating, and at one point I was legitimately thinking, this can't be happening. I passed out on the pavement and this freaking fever dream is occurring right now. But it wasn't. What was occurring to me in that moment was real, and there was no getting out of it. The guy even picked up on how scared I was after he directed his driver to take me home, and he started saying how I didn't have to worry about a thing if I just did as he told me. And there was no time limit on it either, since my priority was almost not alerting my roommate that I was going through his stuff. And the guy said if I spooked him, he might leave, and I really didn't want him to do that. If I did, he might leave and take that little object with him, which was something he would not allow to happen. I tried once again to tell him that I wasn't right for the job, that I'd mess it up, and he should just find someone more professional. Now he responded with a pee-wee baseball coach saying stuff like, "Sure you can, kid. You're his roomie. I'm sure he trusts you." And he added that Adam, the name of my roommate there, might even have the object that I was looking for lying around on a coffee table or something. All I needed to do was head down there with a six-pack while the game was on and take a little look around after asking him to use the bathroom. I remember telling the man that Adam wasn't that kind of person, but he only said, "I'm sure you'll think of something, kid. You'll see." And a few minutes later, the guy was dropping me off a block over from my place, saying he'd be in touch the following week. I got out, just feeling numb as I walked back to my place, and then I spent the next few hours wondering what in God's name I was going to do. I tried asking the guy his name before I got out. I tried asking who they were with, too. I got answers to neither, and the guy just said, "It's not important." And then after asking me not to slam his door too hard, he and his boys took off into the night. I didn't even try to memorize the license plate because I believe every word of what he said about the cops. And even if he didn't have anyone on his payroll, they wouldn't be able to protect me from him, not in the short term anyway. And so really, what choice did I have other than to do what that weirdo said? And so I spent the next couple of days fixating on two things. Firstly, I wondered how the heck I was going to get into Adam's place without alerting him, and secondly, I wondered who the hell he was to have landed himself in so much trouble. All I knew was that he was anemic looking, worked in tech, and liked to stay out all night. And then if he was just some nerd, why not snatch him off the street, kind of like they did with me, and then get what they wanted that way? And if it was that important, why not just kick his door down in the middle of the night? Why get me involved? Was Adam dangerous, and if so, how? Those are all of the thoughts that were running through my head over the next week or so, and since I didn't know the first thing about robbery or burglary, I figured my best chance was to sort of fake a break-in. I could make it look like something it wasn't, and if the little labeled object I was looking for didn't move, then maybe he wouldn't take off with it. And I was still toying with that idea the next time I ran into the man in the black sedan. Now, I was walking to my car after work when I spotted his car, and while I'd been just about flinching at anything that looked like it for the past week, this was the real deal. The back door swung open, and I heard that same Bill Burr Boston accent say, "Hey buddy, what do you say we have ourselves a little talk?" I thought about running, but I knew that'd just piss him off, and so I climbed into the back seat with him and we had ourselves that little talk. At first, he asked me how things were going, if I'd made any moves yet, stuff like that, and I was honest with him. I told him I was still in the planning stages, that I was pretty inexperienced with things like that, and that he'd have to give me more time, a lot more time to get it done. And the guy kind of nodded, but added that he didn't have all the time in the world, so I should start making moves now. And that's when the second part happened, the scary part, because when I once again suggested that I wasn't the right guy for the job because I didn't have the moves he was referring to, and I was sure that I'd messed things up, the guy asked me, "So how's Annie doing?" Now the question had the color draining from my face. I literally felt lightheaded when he said it, like a damned bobblehead just trying to keep my head pointed the right way up. My heart started beating faster. I got that cold, sweaty feeling all over again, and try as I might, but I couldn't stop my hands from shaking, because Annie was my grandmother's name. Now I didn't act like some tough guy. I didn't tell him if you ever lay a finger on her or anything like that. And I was just too stunned to speak, and I stayed too stunned until the guy reassured me that she wasn't in danger. He just wanted to know how she was doing. I didn't answer him. I just told him I'd have the job done by that time next week. And that's when the third portion of our conversation commenced, and he gave me a little advice. He told me to case the place, familiarize myself with it, and to do it soon. The guy then smiled, asked me not to slam his door again, and that marked the end of our second meeting. I thought about what he said about casing the place, which, for those who don't know, is basically the word criminals use for recon or scouting out or looking around. Getting a look at the place before I actually look for the thing would give me an idea of where everything was and where I most likely needed to look. And so, as strange as it might sound, I tried the idea I originally dismissed and showed up at Adam's door with a 6-pack of beer, some energy drinks, and 2 boxes of that chef's choice sushi. I figured I could pass the whole thing off as a sort of thanks for being a cool neighbor gift, so even if he didn't drink, I could talk my way inside with that good sushi that I brought. But even so, getting inside was no easy task. When I knocked on his door, Adam obviously didn't seem too excited on letting me inside. A few weeks back, I'd have put that all on him being nothing more than shy, an anxious person maybe, but right then, I knew there was something bigger going on. That didn't stop me from keeping my cool, and I guess that was down to me not having to pretend to be interested in him. I've been wondering about what he did, how he lived, and what his part of the house looked like for months by that point, and so I didn't have to put on some Oscar-winning performance to make that believable for him. I only really sold the idea of me coming inside by saying I'd basically never ask him again. All I wanted to do was get a feel for my not-so-new roomie, and then I'd leave him in peace like I usually did. He still didn't want to, and that much was obvious, but he knew that accepting my offer meant that I'd leave him alone in the long run, so he invited me inside. Adam's place was spotless. The decor was minimal and monochrome, and he didn't have a television that I could even see, and he had those 2 huge bookcases filled to bursting with all kinds of computer and tech-centric books. And after he put the sushi in his refrigerator, he showed me around a little, not saying all that much, but just trying to be polite, I guess. Now I started asking about his job, and he said he worked mostly from home, but when I asked to see his setup, he lost what little of the friendliness he had about him and just said no. I tried to play it off like I was just being curious. I wasn't set on and expecting every nook and cranny, even though I was. But then, as I carried on getting vague non-answers to my questions about his job, I was looking around the room and seeing a lot of security cameras. I saw a lot. There were 3 of them set up around the living space and kitchen, all pretty sleek and small ones too. But that was 3 more than I had, and seeing as they made my job that little bit harder, I couldn't help but ask about them. Now, I turned it into a little joke, I suppose, asking if he was just paranoid or I needed that kind of equipment for my own part of the house. Adam just kind of looked at me, like he couldn't think of an explanation, and then murmured something about how it was good to be safe. He didn't seem like a bad guy, you know? I mean, maybe it was just how scared he was, but I couldn't imagine him really doing much harm to anyone or really anything. He was just some computer nerd. One that had done pretty good in life to afford that kind of living arrangement, but a computer nerd nonetheless. And if the mysterious man in the black sedan was sort of like the villain of this story, then maybe Adam was the victim. And if both things were true, then I figured it presented me with the perfect opportunity to make myself the hero. Maybe the phrasing of that makes me sound a little up my own ass or whatever, but I can promise you, fear and the relief of having extracted myself from a difficult situation were also very strong motivators here. I knew that I didn't have it in me to get all Mission Impossible and break in there after deactivating his cameras and hacking his computer and blah 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 Hollywood nonsense. I had to talk to the guy. I mean, really talk to him so we could figure out something together. And it wasn't something I planned before walking into his place. The urge just sort of took me then and there. And when I asked him again why the cameras were there, and I got another non-answer about security, I asked if the reason he wanted security was because he'd taken something that didn't belong to him. And the second I asked him, the friendliness dropped away again, only that time he looked frightened too. He asked who I was, like who I really was, because I guess he figured I worked for someone. In response, I literally said nobody, absolutely nobody, and I wanted to stay that way too. And then before he had a chance to really panic or anything, I told him exactly what happened with the guy in that black sedan, and how he seemed to know everything, how he was threatening my grandmother, and how he was looking for something that was D-FN or whatever the label was I wrote earlier. Now, I added that all he wanted me to do was report back on where I'd found it, and not to take it. And so whatever it was, he could just leave it someplace, tell me where, and then get the F out of town before the sedan man's goon showed up to collect it, it seemed. I mean, because I was pretty damn sure they'd collect him along with it, and while that'd be rough on my conscience, it'd most likely be even worse for him. Adam agreed, and he actually got kind of emotional as he thanked me for telling him, but I was still very much in the mode of, we need to fix this crap, and now. And so I had to sort of hurry along the buddy-buddy moment and figure out what we were going to do and what was going on. Adam said he needed to copy what was on that drive, as he called it, and he also needed to erase and destroy all the computer stuff he had before leaving. And then including the time he needed to pack some stuff and arrange for someplace else to stay, he figured he could be gone in about 12 hours, so 7 o'clock the next morning. And when he left, he'd leave that DF drive, that he called it, tucked behind the back of a picture frame hanging from a wall in his workspace. And that's where I could tell the guy that I'd found it, and since I couldn't do that until the next time I saw him, Adam would have plenty of time to get far, far away from Seattle. He tried to thank me again, but I wouldn't accept it, because it was now all on him to make sure our little deception wasn't uncovered. He needed to put that drive thing exactly where he'd said it'd be, and he needed to keep the hell away from the entire Pacific Northwest for all I cared. Because if they found out I'd helped him, then we'd both be screwed. Adam promised he'd disappear and that the men threatening my grandma would find what they were looking for, just not the only copy of it. And he only very cryptically reassured me that whatever was on that drive, its release couldn't be traced back to the agreement we'd made. I don't know if that was true or not at the time, but I guess me still breathing is a testament to Adam's honesty. At the time, though, nothing could have fully reassured me. And then after shaking his hand and wishing him luck, I went up to my part of the house, and in the morning, he was gone. I honestly thought dealing with the situation would be like a weight off my shoulders. After all, I'd done what was asked of me and located that little drive, so what else was there to worry about? Well, Turns out a whole lot, actually, because I still needed the guy in the sedan to buy my story and believe that I hadn't tipped Adam off before he vanished. At times, I thought about vanishing myself because if this guy saw through my act, and he was probably going to do just that since he seemed to know everything anyway, then I was screwed. Even if they got the little drive thing they wanted, the guy'd be pissed that I'd lied to him, and big successful criminals don't get that way by being nice and forgiving, do they? Well, a few days go by, and then lo and behold, I finish work one night to see that same black car sitting a few spaces down from my own. The back door opens up as I approach, and then I sit down in the back seat with that smiling jackass sitting next to me. I didn't have to act like I was sick of seeing him, and neither did I need to act nervous about the drive being where Adam said he'd leave it. So, all in all, I guess I was pretty convincing when I said they needed to make their move so that the drive would still be in the place I found it when they did. I remember saying something along the lines of, "I'm not having you guys blame me if he moves it. I did my part already, now leave me the hell alone." And the guy starts laughing that Bill Burr laugh of his heh heh heh, and then told me to calm down and that he'd make their move that night. He said I better go check in a hotel or something, that I should concoct a story about meeting up with a girl or something to that effect if anyone asks, because when the cops got involved, it'd be easier for me to just say I didn't see anything because I wasn't there. And the last thing I said, and I figured this'd be the last thing I ever said to the guy, was, "What about my money?" Now, don't think I was dumb enough to expect to get paid. I'm not that naive when it comes to the criminal underworld, but I also figured not asking would maybe raise suspicion somehow, so I did. Now, I'm sure this won't come as a surprise to any of you with fully functioning brains, but when I asked to be paid, the guy just laughed that heh 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 laugh of his and asked me why he'd pay me for something I just did for free. I took the guy's advice. I didn't want to make him think that I had a whole parallel plan going on, so I got the hotel room. And the next morning, when I made my way back to my car and drove home, one of the front doors had been smashed open, and Adam's apartment had been broken into as well. I called the cops, acted totally ignorant of everything, and just like the guy said, I was able to sort of say I didn't see anything because I was in a hotel with a girl that I met at work. And a uniformed cop later asked me why I hadn't brought the girl back to my place, but he seemed satisfied when I looked very sheepish and told him that we didn't want her husband finding out. And he gave me one hell of a judgmental look, but he didn't question anything further. I then had the landlord call me to ask me what the hell was going on, and she stopped by that same afternoon to take a look around. She seemed relieved that Adam's place was the only one targeted and that neither of us had been home when whoever it was broke in. After that, I thought that was pretty much it, that I'd somehow navigated dealing with some big-shot gangster without getting anyone hurt, and given enough time, the info, or whatever that Adam got away with, might get around to biting big fat Bill Burr on his freaking fat ass. But then came the night he and his boys showed up outside work again, in their big black sedan with its tinted windows. I didn't have to act or play pretend when I responded, I thought we were done. What else do you want from me?" But that time, Big Bill Burr didn't play pretend either. He didn't say, "Oh hey buddy, how's it going?" like he normally did. He just leaned out a little and then growled at me to get in the car before he had his guy drag me in. Now I knew that was the last time, I didn't, but that's what I told myself as I headed for the car. Just one more time, and then this whole goddamn nightmare is over. I thought it'd be the easiest one, with all the hard stuff having been and gone, and I even figured that the guy might even see it good to pay me now that he'd gotten what he'd wanted. But that's not what happened. After I climbed into the back, and one of Fat Bill Burr's goons closed the door behind me, I tried to basically go on the offensive. Any kind of nervousness, and I might as well just write "I tipped him off" on my forehead with a Sharpie. But even after saying, "What do you want now, dude? You said we were done," he completely shut me down by saying, "I know what you did." I had to keep going. I couldn't just quit right there and then, and so I pushed back saying, "Yeah, you do. I risked going to jail for you, maybe even got myself shot. But here you are, still bothering me." I didn't get past the "here you are" part before they cut me off again. Told me the only reason I was still alive was because he couldn't prove that I tipped off my roommate. He admitted to getting his hands on that drive, the one with a DF code on it. But as I suspected, he wanted his hands on Adam too, and he was angry that he slipped through his fingers. He asked me straight up if I'd tipped Adam off, and when I said no, he just rolled his eyes and called me a lying sack of crap. He then told me that for my information I should know that a body washed up on Alki Beach that very morning, and the cops thought it was my roommate, Adam. But Fat Bill Burr knew it wasn't. He said the reason the cops were so convinced it was Adam was because the body that they found had Adam's teeth. But it wasn't Adam, and Fat Bill Burr wanted me to know that the blood of that random homeless dude was on my hands and not his. And that was the only time I couldn't hold up my act anymore, and Bill Burr saw it. He then says, "Oh, you didn't think about that part, did you, kid? You didn't really take the time to find out who your little roommate was, huh?" I think I must have stammered or made some gesture because he seemed to know what I was going to say and anticipated it with, "You didn't need to know, so we didn't tell you. And even if you didn't tell him anything, you had one job to do, kid, and you messed it up." I remember telling the most unconvincing lie ever, saying I swear I didn't tell him. But all that guy said in response was, "Get out of my car," before reminding me once again not to slam his door. And that was the last I saw of Fat Bill Burr. I wasn't sure, and I'm still not 100% sure if this guy just sort of made all that stuff up as a way of making me feel guilty. Killing me was just more trouble, and I guess so was beating the crap out of me and giving me a real reason to go to the cops. But planning something like that in my head, a lie that I couldn't never really confirm or disprove, I think that was supposed to be his parting shot. I'm happy to say that it didn't hit the target, not after a while anyway. I did a whole bunch of digging online and not a single body has been brought in from Alki all year, and the last being maybe 18 months previous to this. So Fat Bill Burr just had to have been lying, I think. Adam wasn't a bad guy. He might have done something dumb to have the mob on his ass like that, but I feel pretty confident that I'd done the right thing in warning him. I still feel that way, and I feel like I managed to navigate my ship through some very stormy waters, and somehow I managed to thread the needle in a way that saved both mine and Adam's asses. I feel pretty proud of myself sometimes, and it reminds me that taking the hard road and doing the right thing even when it's tough and scary is always the right way to go. But if I go the rest of my life never having to make tough choices like that again, I'll be a very happy man, and wherever Adam is these days, I hope he's okay, and that him and that Fat Bill Burr will never cross paths again. My name's Ryan, and I'm a grad student here in NYC, and I just managed to escape from the worst roommate I've ever had. I've been a fan of the show for a while now, and I've always kind of hoped that I'd never have a reason to contribute. I thought I could just listen to everyone else's creepy stories and never experience one of my own, but I guess that all changed when I met Kurt. I won't bore you with all the ins and outs of my housing situation in September last year, but let's just say that I needed a place to stay, and I needed it badly. And so I ended up going to view a single room in a shared apartment where my roomie would be a guy called Kurt. And Kurt wasn't there during the viewing, and I'm guessing that not only was that on purpose, but the landlord had the place scrubbed down to make it look like a regular, sane person lived there. After some couch surfing, I moved in on a 6-month contract starting October 1st of last year, and when I first met Kurt, I had absolutely no measure of what a creep he was going to be. He seemed like a quiet guy, into his old-school heavy metal with his long red hair and beard, and I honestly figured the only issue might be loud music or something like that. But pretty quickly, Kurt showed his character. And the first thing, and probably the least creepy thing relative to everything else, was his music. He played bass guitar, and at first me and him were pretty cool, so I asked him what band he was into after hearing him play one day. Now, he was into much more extreme stuff, but we talked about bands like Sabbath, Zeppelin, and my personal favorite, AC/DC, for a while, and it was cool to find some shared interests. But then, Kurt asked if I wanted to listen to something he wrote. Now, I responded saying, sure, go ahead, and then he gets out his phone and starts playing this recording that's just his bass line and a drum track. It sounded pretty cool at first, like kind of creepy sounding, but still pretty good, and it kind of reminded me of Dawn Patrol by Megadeth, if you know the song. Some vocals kicked in, something kind of weird sounding I had to almost concentrate on to hear. But then I realized I wasn't hearing anyone singing. It sounded like a young woman talking, and she sounded very upset. I figured it was some kind of spoken word thing that he was working on with someone, but then, as the girl kept on talking, I realized that she was the survivor of a violent, carnal assault, and that she was recounting her experiences either in court or some kind of police tape. I said, "Dude, is it real?" And not like a sort of, "oh man, that's cool" kind of way, like, "what the F" kind of way. But Kurt just smiled and nodded and then started telling me about the exact crime it was from and things like that. I didn't say it to his face, but I thought using that audio was in very, very poor taste. But like I said, I didn't want to start an argument or cause any tension, and so I just palmed him off with something like, good art is always provocative, I guess, and then turned our talk onto something else. I only had to live with the guy, and I didn't think his weird taste in tunes meant that he was a serial killer or anything like that, but then I guess in that department, the thing he did next did him no favors. So I come home, I'm hungry, I open the fridge, and there's a bunch of what looks like organ meats in unlabeled jars, and the whole fridge stinks like vinegar. I felt like his stepdad or something going up to his room and asking him, like, "Hey buddy, what's that you left in the refrigerator there? It's awfully stinky for shared food storage, don't you think?" Now Kurt's just sitting there, blasted out of his skull and listening to the Melvins, and while yes, the Melvins rule, they don't pair well with pickled organ meats. Kurt apologized, told me they were sort of not-so-live models for an art project that he was working on, and said that he'd have them out of the fridge by the end of the week. Again, this wasn't so bad, because while it wasn't nice looking at a shriveled-up pig's heart every time I grabbed some creamer, it wasn't affecting my quality of life or anything like that. But then, come the end of the week, the way Kurt chose to dispose of those organs pushed things to a whole other level. I woke up to take a leak at about 4 o'clock in the morning, and I had to be up at 6:30, so I'm pissed that I'm actually losing out on sleep. I hit the upstairs hallway in my boxers, breathing through my nose, all half asleep, and then, bam, this smell like sour death just punches me in the nose. I can hear frying coming from downstairs, and so I kind of knew what Kurt was doing before I saw it. But I went down anyway to make sure, and when I saw him frying those pickled organs in a goddamn pan, I said, "Dude, what the actual F are you doing right now?" Again, Kurt was all apologies like he always was. I promise that's not a Nirvana reference, but that time I was actually pissed off. Because once I went back up to bed, all I could smell was that sour death smell after it had gotten into my room. I couldn't go back to sleep at all. Like half because of the smell and half because of how mad I was that he'd try and cook that crap at 4 in the goddamn morning. It made him sick too, like he pretty much occupied the bathroom for the next 48 hours, meaning that I was relegated to peeing in bottles whenever he was camped out in there or whenever I was too scared to witness the aftermath. And that kind of knocked the pep out of him for a while, I suppose, because there was no more weird behavior out of Kurt, at least none I could see. Now the next thing happened maybe 2 or 3 weeks later when I came home to find a piece of meat hanging from some string he had tied to a cabinet handle, just sort of hanging there over the workspace. It didn't have a hook going through it like you might be imagining. It was sort of all wrapped up and tied in a string, but then the string had little tiny pieces of metal hooked on them, and so the meat looked like it had maybe 4 or 5 of these little metal tags on it. Each tag had weird little symbols on it that was different to the others. Now right away I'm thinking, Kurt, what the hell, man? And while I wanted to just toss it because it was a freaking dripping onto the counter, I just wrapped it up in plastic and put it in the fridge for him. Kurt comes home asking why I moved his meat, and then asked me not to do it again because he was curing it. I asked him if he put any salt on it, like fully knowing that he didn't because I saw it, and when he said no, I said he needed to put a lot of salt on it if he wanted to cure it. Now he says, "Oh, okay, thanks." And then when I visit the kitchen, there it is again. No salt, no rub, no nothing. It's just there. I looked up how to cure meat, and what I read says you actually do gotta put it in the fridge while it's salted, and so at that point I'm thinking, okay, why the hell is he lying to me? I didn't want to argue with him. I like the quiet life, you know? And so instead of actually telling him what a disgusting creep he was being with his little hellraiser ornament, I very politely suggested that he keep his meat in his bedroom so he wasn't making the kitchen unsanitary. I also added that he was going to make it a safety issue. I had no choice but to contact the landlord. I wasn't a dick about it. It was more like, just work with me, dude. And since he wasn't a total a-hole, Kurt agreed to do just that and keep his meat in his room. The final straw was when the smell of rotten meat started seeping out from under his bedroom door, and then it wasn't long before I noticed an uptick of flies in our apartment. I got in touch with the landlord and asked him to perform some kind of apartment inspection so he could personally tell Kurt to stop just letting raw meat rot in his bedroom. He said he was busy for a couple of days and he would be over the first chance he got. But before then, I realized why the apartment was starting to smell worse and worse. It wasn't just seeping out from Kurt's door. He was hiding pieces of it around the apartment and letting it rot. He didn't get violent or yell at me when I confronted him about it. He gave me some evil-looking death stare, but he didn't say anything. He just slammed his bedroom door in my face, told me he didn't want to talk to me anymore, and at that I called the landlord again and told him not to bother coming over, or at least not on my behalf anyways, because I wanted out. I still had to pay him a month's rent at the start of this month, but I honestly thought it was worth it just to get away from Kurt in that apartment. I think he's a scumbag because I figured that he deliberately hid Kurt's character from me, who, by the way, was having his rent paid by his goddamn parents. I also used to wonder how he could afford to live there without any discernible source of income, but on the way out, the landlord mentioned it and it all suddenly made sense. The same landlord actually offered me an alternative place to stay, but there was no way in hell that I was about to trust him again. Not after he basically tricked me into living with a freak like Kurt. So let me tell you a story about how the best living situation I ever had turned into the worst living situation I ever had, and why there's never been a truer statement than never judge a book by its cover. So many moons ago now, I was looking for places to live in the city I'm at when I came across this pretty amazing apartment while going through the listings. The decor is awesome, it's all furnished, and it was maybe 15 minutes walk away from my job too, so literally perfect in almost every possible way. The only drawback was that it was a shared apartment. Now, I wasn't completely averse to living with someone, but I also knew that if there was a clash of personalities or something like that, then things could get pretty tense pretty quick. I'd previously lived with a guy, I'm a guy myself by the way, who could only be safely described on YouTube as a Neolithic savage, because if I go into any detail I'll probably get this video flagged if you actually read it. Now my point is, I knew that there was no point in me living in that place if the roomie was going to be difficult, and so I asked the landlord if I could meet him during the viewing, and that is how I met Todd. And Todd seemed like the dream roommate, honestly. He said he worked a lot and that he liked going to the gym and all of that in his spare time, but when he said that he'd be out of the apartment a lot, he wasn't kidding. I had the whole place to myself pretty much all day, every day, and the only times that I'd catch him chilling on the couch was when the game was on or when he had an injury or something like that. But even when he was home, I was stoked to have him around. He was a funny guy, he was clean, and he was chill too, so generally nice and easy to live with. But then came the night when everything changed. So the place had these 2 big bedrooms, these ensuite bathrooms, the works. Mine had a lock on the door too, but I didn't think that I'd need it, you know? Todd was a respectful and mature enough person to knock before entering and whatnot, so while I briefly considered using the lock, in the end I was sort of thinking, why bother? Now anyways, I've been living there for just over a month with absolutely 0 complaints all around, and the whole time, Todd was the ideal roomie. But then one night, I woke up needing to pee in the middle of the night like usual, and when I rolled over in bed, all I could see was this dark figure standing by the open doorway. And I freaking screamed so loud. I pretty much dived backwards off the bed, still screaming at the top of my lungs. Then, by the time I grabbed the little folding knife I kept in the drawer, Todd had switched on the light. It was him, standing there in his underwear, but as weird as it might sound, he was just as surprised as I was. You see, Todd wasn't aware that he'd got up out of bed and walked into my bedroom because he'd been sleepwalking. Now, I said he probably should have just told me that once I'd moved in, but as it turned out, Todd hadn't done any sleepwalking for years. He said he used to do it a bunch when he was a kid, especially after he and his family moved house one time, and he figured it was probably the change of me moving in having triggered it or something, and said that he'd never had neglected to mention if he'd been actively sleepwalking. I just wanted to get to sleep, honestly, so I just told him everything was fine and then went back to bed. Now, the next morning, I texted him to say basically, "Hey, sorry if that was weird, and I'm sorry about your condition coming back. I hope everything's okay." He told me we were good, but that maybe I should start locking my door in the future. I texted him back saying, "Sure thing, Captain Obvious," with maybe a laughing emoji, and then we were pals again. Now, from then on, I started locking my door at night, but it also wasn't like Todd wasn't doing anything about it. He said he went to some doctor who gave him a prescription for mild sleeping pills, and then for about a week or so, there was nothing. And then one night, I'm asleep in bed and I hear bang, 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 bang on my bedroom door. Now, once again, I'm just about jumping out of bed, but since Todd's knocking, I figured that he must be awake, so I asked him what's up. But I get zero response. I knew he must have been sleepwalking, so I called out to him to say, Hey, wake up!" All that kind of stuff, but again, I got no reply. I got up out of bed thinking, please don't make this a regular thing. And then when I opened up the door, there's Todd, buck naked, with his eyes all rolled up in their sockets so all I could see was the whites. I yelled something, slammed the door, and I think that's what woke him up, because the next thing I hear is him saying sorry and then running back to his room, still apologizing. I didn't follow him. I was mad, but what the hell could I do? The guy had some serious condition. It wasn't really his fault. And so I went back to sleep, went to work the next morning, and then called Todd at lunch to see how he was doing. He kept apologizing for waking me up, but I made it clear that as long as he was seeking help, then it was fine, because sooner or later the issue would be resolved, and that's aside from the fact that he couldn't really help it. He was super grateful, which was fine, because what choice did I have other than to work with him? And then again, that same sort of pattern played itself out. He went to the doctor, got more powerful sleeping pills, and even started hammering cardio at the gym after work to really tire himself out, you know? And there were another couple of weeks without incidents, and then once again, I woke up to Todd banging on my door in the middle of the night. I was just getting so tired of it by then. Almost every time we thought he'd handled it, it came back all over again. I started to suspect that he might not be sleepwalking, and that this was sort of like a weird way of trying to force me out. But I guess that was my paranoia and exhaustion talking because, well, I guess you'll soon see. And so he bangs on my door, wakes me up, and I start telling him to wake up and go back to bed. I put my head back down on the pillow, and he didn't knock again, but I also didn't hear him wake up or walk back to his room, so I got up, walked to the door, and started listening out for him. I figured that he might have maybe quickly walked off to another part of the house, but I also didn't want to just open my door up just in case he was standing there naked again. And so as I said, I listened, and what I heard sent a chill run through me. Todd was standing on the other side of the door, all right, and I knew that because he was whispering something. I knew it was just his unconscious brain working and that what he was saying probably didn't mean a thing, but just hearing him whispering on the other side of the door gave me the creeps, big time. I ended up waking him up by banging on the door back at him, and it sucked to hear him get scared and frightened, but at least it let me know that he was for real. I started questioning why him knocking on my door didn't wake him up, but me knocking back at him did. But I guess it was sort of like the outside stimulus throwing him off his sleep rhythm or something, because, like I said, I don't suspect him of faking this anymore. Now anyway, the final time it happened, before I started to consider just leaving at the end of that month, I recorded it to show Todd that next morning, and I guess just so he could see things from my perspective. Now he started hammering on my door again, and I tried waking him up by banging back, but for some reason that didn't work, and he started whispering again. Now I banged a second time, thinking another round of knocking back might do the trick, but all that did was make Todd start speaking louder, and it was then that I heard what he was saying for the first time, and it was almost like a prayer, but all kinds of jumbled. There was a lot of, "Our Heavenly Father, Lord, hallowed be thy name," but none of it actually went anywhere. It was all these phrases just sort of looping and spiraling until it sounded almost like nonsense talk, just like an edge of reason to it. Now he spoke in this weird voice too, like in the back of his throat almost, and I honestly think that it was one of the single creepiest things I've ever heard in my life. If I just woke up to that on the first night it happened, then I'd have been even more spooked than when Todd just appeared in my room. But since I kind of knew what was happening, I just went back to bed with a pillow wrapped around my head and tried to get some sleep. Now the next morning before I left for work, I showed him the video I took the previous night. It obviously didn't show much of him, but it captured all the creepy sounding nonsensical prayers that he recited in the back of his throat voice of his. I massively regret showing him that video, and I didn't do it to be mean or anything like that. I just needed him to see how serious it was and how bad he was disturbing my sleep. But oh man, the second he heard himself, it was like the stuffing had been knocked out of him. He went quiet. He said sorry, and then after telling him I'd see him later and we could talk about it after work, I figured that he'd head out the door like he usually did. Only he didn't. He just sat down at the kitchen table and he started to cry. Now later that day I got a text from Todd saying that he was checking himself into some kind of medical facility and that he might not be back for a month or two, maybe more. I had the apartment all to myself for a while, which was nice in a way, but I was really worried about Todd. We kept in touch and I'd ask him how his treatment was going and all of that, but he'd always give me one-word answers and then change the subject like he didn't want to talk about it. I remember thinking it probably wasn't going well since he didn't want to talk about it much, and then after 2 months, Todd told me that he wouldn't be moving back to live with me, and he'd be sending someone over to gather his stuff. It was sad, knowing this super capable guy was having such trouble with a medical condition. I mean, it was creepy as hell being in the middle of all of that, and I think it'd have been a hell of a lot more frightening if I didn't know what was going on. But I did, and there was a rational explanation for it. It just sucked it was happening to him, and I lost his number after losing my phone, so these days I can't reach out to see how he's doing. So Todd, buddy, if you just so happen to be listening to this somehow, I hope you're doing much better, and I still think about you from time to time. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, and there are super fun live streams on Sundays and Wednesday nights. If you got a story, be sure to submit them over at my email at letsreadsubmissions@gmail.com, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks for members of the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories and big compilations located anywhere you listen to podcasts. I also have a true crime channel called Saturn Soul, and all those links can be found in the description below. Thanks so much, friends, and remember, don't trade your Pokemon for peanuts. Hey guys, before the video begins, I just wanted to let you know I opened up a new tier on my Patreon where some friends and I will be reviewing horror movies. It's called the Dead Astronauts Movie Review Podcast, and the first episode is up, and it's a review of an awesome cult classic, The Exorcist. Go check it out, link down below, and thank you to everyone who listens and supports the channel. God bless.
My name's Allie. I'm from Las Vegas, and growing up, I was something of a problem child. I hit rock bottom after getting so drunk in my teenage years that I gave myself alcohol poisoning, and I had to go to the hospital to get my stomach pumped. And then when I woke up, I had the single worst hangover of my entire life, and my parents were there. It was a whole thing. Mom just cried. My dad was mad as hell, though, and said that I had two choices. I could go dry out on my uncle's farm up north, or they'd send me to some Christian sober camp full of born-again weirdos. They didn't have the money to send me to some fancy smanchy rehab center, so those were my two options, and I chose the farm. Technically, Uncle Alan wasn't exactly my uncle. He was more like one of my dad's third cousins, but he'd been living up north on this little ranch for the past 20 years or so, and since he and Dad were close when they were kids, he figured that he could call in a favor. Alan agreed, and so off I went for a whole 2 weeks so I could dry out and learn the meaning of hard work. The ranch was up near a little town called Wild Horse, and to get there, we had to drive into the hills for a few miles before we reached a large green gully, like a dimple in the hills, kind of. And that was my uncle's farm. It wasn't big, but he had plenty growing there. He had a tomato patch, a plot for all kinds of chilies, and then on the other side, he had a big watermelon patch and a whole orchard full of apricot trees. It was a really beautiful place, and I started to think that it might be a pretty cool place to dry out for a while. But bearing in mind that we're arriving at night, so as Dad's headlights hit it, I suddenly saw just how run down the house was. It looked like it used to be a nice place, like back when it was built, but by the time I arrived there, it looked bad. There was also a part of me that thought it would be like, "Hey, long time no see, kid." But no, this guy did not seem pleased to see me at all. He and my dad said hi to each other, then I just stood by thinking that I was about to be introduced or something, but my Uncle Alan cuts my dad off as he's speaking and then very sternly tells me to get in the house. Now, I'm kind of stunned that he'd even talk to me like that, especially right in front of my father. But all Dad did was tell me to listen to Alan. This was after sundown too, maybe like 9:30ish, so I started walking towards the lights of the house in front of me while in a total state of shock. I remember thinking how I should have chosen the Christian camp and how at least they'd have been nice to me. And then the first thing I noticed as I walked towards the house was how all the windows had been papered over with old newspapers. I walked inside thinking that I made the second biggest mistake of my life, the first being alcohol poisoning, and then after putting my bag down, it wasn't long before Alan walked in behind me, told me to take my bags upstairs into the guest room. No "hi, how are you," no offering to help me, just grab your crap and get moving. The guest bedroom's window overlooked the front of the house, and it would have made for a nice view if it wasn't papered over. And then just seconds after sitting down in the bed, wondering what the heck I got myself into, I heard Alan suddenly call me downstairs. And that's when he laid down the rules, and they were harsh ones. Basically, it all came down to three things. I was going to work, and I was going to do what I was told, and I was forbidden from leaving the house for any reason at all. The first two I kind of expected, but not being able to leave the house at all had me thinking, you gotta be kidding me, right? Well, he was not kidding, and if I didn't like it, I was welcome to march my ass back into Wild Horse to catch the bus back to Vegas. And since I didn't have so much as a penny to my name, I was basically a prisoner there. I figured the only thing that'd get me through was going for walks in the orchard or picking ripe watermelons for us to eat. But no, I had to stay inside and either cook, clean, or read. Not because Alan had decided those were my options, but because there was literally nothing else to do. I just cried that first night. I cried myself to sleep, actually, thinking the next 2 weeks were going to be hell on earth. But while I sure got a little taste of hell, it came much sooner than I was expecting, and it didn't come from Alan. The first day started pretty well, actually, because if there was one thing Alan was good at, it was cooking. I got this big breakfast of bacon, eggs, biscuits, and black coffee, and it was all great. But that breakfast wasn't so much a treat as it was fuel for the work that followed. He had me cleaning that house all freaking day,
stopping only for an admittedly very good lunch of chicken salad sandwiches. And that was the friendliest Alan got with me. When I asked if he'd grown the tomatoes that we were eating, he said yes. I said they were good, and then he kind of pursed his lips and nodded before we kept on eating in silence. Now, I guess that's how I knew that he didn't completely hate me, but it was clear that he didn't exactly want me there either. And so after lunch, I went back to work to earn my keep. That first day sucked, and the second day was more of the same. But then weirdly, by the end of the third day, I was actually starting to feel kind of at home. I guess it was the psychological effect of the place looking and smelling nice, but I started feeling this weird sense of ownership, and I found a newfound appreciation for sobriety. Alan didn't exactly warm up to me, ever actually, but he did stop being such an a-hole with me once I started to sort of get with the program. But then that night, the third of my stay with him, I realized that there was a lot more to him than met the eye. So remember how I said that my windows were papered over? Well, there was a tiny little gap in one of them between the paper and the frame, meaning that I could look out over the driveway and some of the vegetable patches if I put my eye up real close. Well, that night, I'm lying in bed, not able to sleep, when I heard voices outside the house. I got curious, and so I ended up rolling out of bed and creeping over to the window to see what's going on. Now, the first thing that I saw were these two dark figures, only dimly lit by the lights coming from the ground floor. And then at their feet, there were two big sacks of what looked to be Alan's produce. They looked like they were leaning over and checking out what the sacks held, and then when I heard the sound of the door opening and closing downstairs, the two figures stood up straight and backed off a little, like they were wary of what Alan might do. Now, I couldn't hear exactly what Alan said to them, but once he'd said it, the two figures reached down and picked up the sacks and then walked off into the darkness. It was weird because, while it looked like a fairly innocent exchange, it didn't seem friendly at all. Alan stayed watching them after they turned and walked off, almost like he didn't trust them. And I don't think these two guys said a single word of thanks, as they took a heck of a lot of fruit and vegetables too. It just looked so odd, and I couldn't help but wonder who these two guys were as I drifted off to sleep that night. Now, the next morning, when I asked who the two nighttime visitors were, Alan looked very shifty before claiming that they were his friends. He also said it in a way that suggested that I shouldn't ask him any more questions, and so I decided to leave things at that. And then maybe an hour or two later, I'm peeling potatoes for that night's dinner. Alan announces he's driving into town. Now, he told me the rules still applied, especially when he was gone, and that I wasn't to leave the house for any reason whatsoever. Not unless it was for an absolute life-or-death emergency. Well, no sooner had he left, and in spite of how much he clearly trusted me not to, I went outside. I mean, can you blame me? The whole outside rule just seemed bizarre at that point. I get that I had to work and stuff to keep my hands and mind occupied, but the idea of not being able to look at all those beautiful trees and the sky, it just seemed ridiculous, you know? Now, I wasn't even considering running off to find drugs or alcohol by that point, so I figured why the heck not, and walked out onto the porch to enjoy the mid-morning sunshine. It was really beautiful out there, and not seeing the sky for about 3 days gave me a real appreciation for being outside again, and it didn't really sink in for me until that day on the porch that Alan had his own little slice of heaven up there in the hills. Assuming that he'd stay in town for a little while, I figured Alan might be gone for 40 to 45 minutes tops, and that gave me at least 20 to 30 minutes to sit out on the porch and enjoy the sunshine before it was back to being a prisoner again. I remember taking a book from Alan's collection, some local history thing that looked like it might be interesting, and then I sat flicking through it until I gave up and started gazing out into the apricot trees. Now, I figured if I got lost in the book, I'd lose track of time, at which point Alan might come home and see me out on the porch, and well, I didn't want that to happen. But then as I'm sitting there, just kind of soaking up the scene, I see someone standing in the apricot orchard maybe 50 yards away. Apricot trees aren't very tall, at least these ones weren't anyway, and they looked more like big bushes and were wide enough so that someone could kind of hide behind them. At least hide their body anyway. Because as I'm looking through the orchard, I see this pair of legs sticking out from under a big patch of green leaves. They weren't moving either. They were just sort of standing there, and from what I could tell, they were just watching me through a gap in all that greenery. Now, my first thought was that it was one of Alan's friends, maybe even one of the guys who visited the previous night. And so, not wanting to be rude or anything, I raised a hand and gave the person a little wave. Not just to say hello, but to say something like, "I see you watching me there, and it's kind of creepy." Now, I figured they'd either move out of embarrassment that I'd caught them staring, or at least wave back. But they didn't move. They just kept on watching me through the leaves of that apricot tree. We entered a kind of lopsided staring contest with me staring at the tree and him staring back at me through that greenery, and then before long I started to get a little creeped out. I remembered how frosty the previous night's exchange had been, how Alan had claimed those guys were his friends, but I didn't believe him. Then, realizing the person I was staring at might have been less than friendly, I got up off that porch swing and then walked back inside the house and went upstairs to watch from my little spy spot. Now, Alan returned not long after, and then after a little bit of lunch, we each kept on working until dinner time. I wanted so badly to ask Alan about those visitors, especially the one who appeared in the orchard that afternoon. But as you're well aware, doing so would have been an admission that I hadn't followed the rules, which was completely off the table for me. Now, I'd only just started to feel settled, so the last thing I wanted to do was piss Alan off so bad that he actually kicked me out, at which point I'd have to walk the entire 10 miles back into Wild Horse, which I definitely didn't want to do. And so, without so much as a word about it, I went to bed hoping that he'd take another trip into town at one point so I could go for a little stroll in the orchard. Now, I didn't want to bump into whoever had been staring at me, that's for sure, but that's just where my head was. Now, anyway, that night, I remember waking up to go to the bathroom, and then when I got back, I heard voices outside again. I went to the window and then looked through the crack between the paper and the frame again. Just like the previous night, those two shadowy figures were standing there, but without any produce at their feet. There was a skinny, taller one and a fatter one, and to me, it looked like Alan was trying to convince the two men of something. I just couldn't figure out what. And then the next thing I knew, Alan was stepping off the porch and making aggressive-looking gestures towards them. I figured they might back off like they did the last night, because I was pretty sure those guys were sort of scared of Alan based on the way they acted when he walked outside to greet them. But this time, their reaction was the complete opposite. They didn't back up. They moved forward, fast. And after knocking Alan off of his feet, they started kicking him again and again and again. I was terrified, and the only thing I wanted to do was hide under the bed until everything had stopped, but I knew that wasn't an option. I ran downstairs to the kitchen to grab the big carving knife that Alan kept in his knife block, and then after running outside onto the porch, I pointed the knife and yelled at the two men to leave him alone. Now, close up, these were the two ugliest SOBs I had ever laid eyes on. I don't want to go guessing and saying that they were inbred, but they sure as hell look like it. They backed off a little once they saw the knife, but neither guy ran off. Instead, the skinny one smiled and pulled a gun on me, and while the other one just sort of laughed. I didn't drop the knife or anything, and I didn't back off either, but a part of me was convinced that I was about to die, and I started shaking like a leaf. Yet for a reason unknown at that moment, the tall, skinny one didn't shoot. As Alan crawled towards me and picked himself up, he told me to get inside in a voice that sounded like he was in a lot of pain. Now, his whole thing had been do as I say, but I knew the moment that I was inside, those two guys were going to keep on kicking the crap out of him, or they were just going to shoot him. It didn't occur to me at the time that if they wanted to shoot either of us, they would have just done it. But like I said, I had no idea what those guys wanted or who they even were, so I didn't know what to expect. And once Alan was back on his feet and moving again, I followed him back towards his front door, taking little sideways crab steps until we were almost back inside again. Now, I yelled that we were going to call the cops, but both guys just started laughing again. Alan didn't have a phone and they knew it, so they were still laughing as they turned and walked off into the darkness. But not before one of them said, in a way that made my skin crawl, "I'll be seeing you real soon, little girl. Real soon." And when we got back inside, I was mad at Alan, yelling, "What the hell is going on? Who were those people?" But he came right back at me with the same energy, yelling, "What the hell were you thinking? I told you not to go outside." It took me a second to figure out how he knew, but then things made sense. The guy who had been watching me in the orchard that time, it was either one of those guys or someone who knew them, and they'd gone and mentioned it to Alan. Now, I had no idea how this was all connected to him getting beat up, but it was very obviously connected somehow. So I remember getting this overwhelming feeling of, "Oh crap, I messed up." I just didn't know why I'd messed up so bad. All I could do was apologize as Alan ranted and raved about how he'd warned me not to go outside. He mentioned something about papering over the windows too, and how he did it so they wouldn't see me. I wasn't mad. It was more like pleading, but I started asking Alan who they really were, because they were quite obviously not friends of his, but also asking him why the hell he'd let me stay there if I wasn't safe. No, I didn't think that he could get any madder, but when I asked him that last thing, he exploded and said the only reason that he'd done my dad the favor was because he said I'd die otherwise. He said things would have been fine had I just followed the rules, and while I don't entirely believe that to be true, I definitely accelerated whatever was coming by showing myself like I did. It was just a whirlwind of emotion in the moment. Now, first off, I was mad at my dad for choosing Alan's farm of all places. And what the actual F was Alan thinking in not letting my dad know that he was being extorted by some kind of redneck mafia, it seemed like. If I'd have known, I'd have chosen that freaking Bible camp in a heartbeat. But I had no idea what was in store for me, and I guess my dad didn't either, or he'd never had wanted me there in the first place. Now, I never found out exactly who those guys were, but then again, Alan didn't really know either. All he said was that they showed up at the farm one night and gave him a choice: provide them with food every so often, or they'd burn it all down. Then, giving the nightly visitors what they wanted kept them from stealing more than they got, at least for a while anyway. They never saw eye to eye, but the way Alan saw it, it was the price that he had to pay to live in his own little slice of heaven, and much more preferable than starting a blood feud with a bunch of cousin-loving sons of bitches, as he put it. Which brings me to the second thing that had my head so whacked out, and that's why Alan and the visitors had gotten into their little altercation. So on the third night, the visitors came to collect the fruit and vegetables, right? But Alan said that he figured they weren't happy with what he'd given them. Then on that afternoon, when I took it upon myself to sit out in the porch swing, one of the visitors spotted me after coming to steal extras. To me, that was an innocent if not fairly creepy encounter, but to the visitors, it meant that Alan had something new to offer them instead of fruit and vegetables. Myself. Obviously, when asked if they could take me away with them for a couple of nights, Alan said hell no, and then when the discussion got so fierce he insulted them, they attacked him. And that explained why the guy didn't shoot me when I appeared with a knife. They wanted to take me alive. I remember that full-body, terror-stricken, this cannot be happening sort of feeling, where I had to drag myself back from the brink of a panic attack. And then once I'd gathered my thoughts, only one of them stuck in my head, and that's how we needed to get the hell out of there, pronto. But not only was Alan in no condition to drive, at least until a couple of painkillers had taken effect, but it wasn't safe for us to drive at night, not with the visitors hanging around and expecting such an escape attempt. And the best thing to do was to just stay put until morning. Now I'm losing my crap at this point, saying, what are they? Effing vampires? But Alan said no, they were just men, and that I should just go get his rifle out of the closet up in his room. We turned off all the lights, and then once Alan was able to walk around and shoulder his gun, we patrolled the house after peeling off all the newspaper from the windows. It was the scariest night of my whole life because it really sunk in for me that there are things much worse than death, And being carted off by those inbred freaks would have been a fate worse than dying. Thankfully, they didn't come back that night, I guess because they were rounding up reinforcements probably for a return visit. But if they did show up again, I was long gone, because Alan drove me into Wild Horse with a shotgun on his lap at the very break of dawn. Now, I thought that I might cry with relief, but I barely even breathed as we drove through those hills, thinking at any moment Alan's truck was going to start getting shot at by people on both sides of the road. I guess the adrenaline only wore off once I was on a bus down to a place called Elko, but even after a sleepless night, I still couldn't rest my eyes enough to fall asleep, and all I could really do was cry. I mean, the fact that I was riding on a bus didn't help, but I think even if I got a motel and a comfortable bed, what happened that previous night would have had me lying there wide awake, wondering what the hell I just escaped from. And the aftermath was obviously messy, but much more boring and depressing compared to the stuff that I just told you about. Dad actually didn't believe me at first, and thought that I might have actually escaped as a way of getting out of rehab. By the time he did finally believe me, he was mad as hell at Alan for not telling him what was going on there. I get the misunderstanding, especially if my dad was telling Alan how I was on death's door, but it was one hell of a thing to suddenly find myself in the middle of, and just days after I almost drank myself to death. Mom later said that Dad drove up to Wild Horse again to confront him, but found no one home when he arrived at the house. All he found was a bunch of broken windows and empty shotgun shells on the front porch. He reported both to local law enforcement, but he never heard back about it. He took a brief look inside, and the fact that he didn't see any blood anywhere gives me hope that Alan is still alive someplace. But I fear his little slice of heaven up there in the hills of northern Nevada belongs to someone else now. So let me tell you about this girl called June, who I was friends with back when I was a kid. I had to move schools near the start of 7th grade, which was a real pain in the butt in terms of settling in and making friends, especially since I'd gone from the city to the country, which might as well have been two different worlds back then. June was the only one in school who bothered to take the time to get to know me, because she also knew what it was like being the new girl. Until just the previous year, June had been homeschooled by her parents on their farm out in the sticks. But then, for whatever reason, they decided to place her in middle school so she could be properly socialized or what have you. And when I say her family lived out in the sticks, in the middle of nowhere, boy, do I mean it. June had to wake up at 4:30 in the morning so her dad could drive her to the nearest town, just so she could catch the 7 a.m. bus to school. Now, she must have felt like double the outsider having to start in a brand new school, having never even been to one before, and I guess that's why she took so kindly to me after I showed up in town. We spent pretty much all of our school days together, and she really helped me settle in. But unlike other kids who'd call each other or go over to each other's houses after school, me and June couldn't do really any of that thanks to how far apart we lived. Now, it was just too far to drive for either of our parents, especially after their long days at work, but that was to be expected. What wasn't was how June's family didn't have a phone line on their property, which obviously meant that they had no phone. That was the first real clue that I had that June's family were different. I mean, aside from the fact that they lived in the middle of nowhere, I didn't even think that it was all that strange that she was homeschooled, since I'd known that was a thing for quite a while. But then in the summer between 7th and 8th grade, I went to stay with June and her family for about a week. And it was then, and only then, that I realized just how different her family really was. And so, like I say, visiting wasn't so easy with June since she lived so far away, and then by the time summer break came around, we couldn't bear to go months at a stretch without seeing each other, so our families made an arrangement. For a whole week, I'd go stay with June and her family out on their farm, and then at some point later on, June could do the same and come stay with us for a week. Now I was really excited to go see her and meet her family, and just as excited for her to meet mine. And then when the time came, I packed a week's worth of my best clothes, a bunch of other stuff that I wanted to show her, and then my dad and I set off on the 4-hour journey to where June lived. Now, it felt like we drove forever, mainly because I couldn't wait to see my best friend, and then when we arrived, I couldn't believe what I was seeing. It was like Junebug, my nickname for her, was living in her very own Disney movie. Her family had their own homestead out there right on the very edge of the wilderness and farming country, and not only was it a really beautiful place, but they had horses too. Junebug ran out in her Oshkosh to give me a hug, and then our dads had a talk and shook hands before mine announced that he was leaving. We hugged and I promised him I'd be good, and then off he went, and I thought I was about to have the best week of my whole life out there on June's family farm. But holy crap, was I wrong about that. That first day and night were great, with her parents and older brother and sister all being super nice to me. But then on the second day, I saw something which made me think all was not as it appeared to be. We were playing around the side of the house and her dad was fixing his truck out near the driveway when I saw this man walking down the dirt road the house was on. I saw him first and then pointed him out to June, and then she yelled to her dad, who looked up and saw him last. It was an older man, one who walked with a slight limp, and I figured it must have been one of June's neighbors. But she said that she'd never seen him before in her life, and when her dad saw him, he started marching up the driveway to cut him off like he didn't want him coming near the house. Now June and I kept on playing, but I kept my eye out on the two men, and while I couldn't hear what they were talking about, I watched them for a minute or two before the older man suddenly dropped to his knees. He was begging June's dad for something, but he was gesturing all mad, pretty much saying, get up, and trying to shoo the man off. It was really weird, and even June stopped to watch as I asked her a whole bunch of questions that I didn't know the answer to. Now that's when I first started to suspect that her dad wasn't the super nice guy like I thought he was. And while he was never anything but wonderful to me personally, things got really strange from there on out. Like when I found the shed at the very back of the backyard. June's family had a gigantic backyard which led onto this big patch of woods that her dad and brother sometimes went hunting in. Then, while we were out playing in the backyard on the third day, I ran over towards the shed only to hear June yell for me to wait. I stopped and turned around, and she was running full pelt to reach me. Then, as she caught her breath, she explained how we weren't allowed to go anywhere near that one shed, and that her dad would be really mad if he caught us. I have to stress, too, the shed wasn't like sitting there out in the lawn. It was way back among the trees, so far you couldn't even see it from the back porch. So when June told me that we had to stay away from it, it kind of made sense that her dad wanted to hide something away in there. I wasn't allowed up near our attic because my dad kept all those dangerous tools up there, so in my head, it made all the sense in the world that June's dad kept things away from the kids. But these days, I don't think that there was anything godly or innocent in there at all, let alone tools. On the fourth day, June's dad and brother went out on a hunting trip. I asked June if we'd be having whatever they caught for dinner, but she said no, that only rarely did they go hunting for meat. I started asking her a whole bunch of questions that she didn't know the answers to again, but we didn't focus on it for long. We were always playing and laughing and talking about what 8th grade would be like, so even once I'd started to notice things, there were too many distractions for me to get too freaked out. A few hours later, June's dad and brother came back with a couple of turkeys. We spotted them walking back through the woods when we were playing in the backyard, and that's when I first noticed how they didn't have any guns with them. Now, I pretty much learned to stop asking questions by then because June didn't seem to know much about anything, bless her heart. But to this day, I wondered to myself, how the hell did they catch those birds if they didn't have guns? Now, for anyone who doesn't know much about turkeys, they're not slow. They can easily outrun a human if they need to, and if they take off flying, forget about it, you're not catching one on foot. So how the heck did her dad and brother manage to catch them by hand? Granted, I know they could have had traps laid out, but their horses roamed all over too, so I don't think that it'd make much sense to risk hurting them, and not just those turkeys. But that was just the smaller side of things, because what really got my attention was how June's brother had all this blood and gore around his mouth and neck. Her dad laughed about how shell-shocked he looked later and explained it as a little rite of passage that his own father had him go through too. But to me, it feels like another one of those things that had a deeper and much darker meaning behind it than what I was being told. We didn't see any of that turkey meat either, just like June said. Her dad just took those things out to his forbidden shed and did God knows what to them. And that night, we woke up to hear June's sister screaming at the top of her lungs. The sound scared the ever-living crap out of me, but June just wrapped a pillow around her head and said it happened all the time. It turns out her sister had these really bad night terrors, and even after she woke up, she wouldn't quite know where she was for the first couple of seconds. And that meant that she sometimes screeched out things like, it's here," when her dad went to wake her up, which is what she yelled the first night she did. She did it again the second night, only she shouted, "It won't stop, it won't stop." That second night it just felt sad. Like listening to the way she cried, how tired she sounded, I just felt awful for her. But I think the thing that bothered me the most, and the thing that I still think was the weirdest and creepiest thing of all, the fowls. And so on the 5th, 6th, and final day of my stay, June's dad was super busy dealing with pregnant horses giving birth. This wasn't a total surprise, as June had already pointed one out before telling me it was pregnant, but apparently 3 of them all decided to give birth right at the same time, which obviously posed quite a challenge to June's dad, brother, and older sister, who joined him to help out. I remember asking June if she was excited to have some young horses running around because they would no doubt be super cute, but she just shrugged and told me how they never survived for very long. And as you can imagine, she didn't know very much. She just said it happened a lot and that her dad always took the newborn fowls to the shed to try and nurse them, but they never survived because they came out different. And when I asked, "What do you mean they come out different?" June told me they came out looking wrong, and it was clear that they weren't going to survive. And then when she said that some of them didn't even look like horses, I told her not to say any more, as the thought of those poor things coming out all confused and in pain just made me want to cry. It was like that for 3 days, and in that time it was mostly just me, June, and her mom around the house. And then every so often the dad, brother, or sister would appear all covered in blood and gunk, usually to grab some water or a bite to eat before heading back to keeping on with their work. It was horrible, and sometimes you could hear these horrible horse screams off in the distance, and so by that 7th and final day of my stay, I was more than ready to go home again. I remember my dad coming to pick me up, and when he asked if I had a nice time during the ride home, I just started to cry. Once I stopped, I explained everything to him, how June's family were nice, just really, really creepy at times. My dad listened to all the stuff about hunting with no guns, the thing about the horses giving birth, and how June never saw the results of any of it, and he was just open-mouthed by the end of it. He and Mom agreed that I was just to never go there again, and they were kind of weird around June when she came to stay with us later in the summer. We stayed friends, at least until the end of middle school when my family moved all over again. Sadly, we didn't end up staying in touch for more than a year, and I have no idea where she is now or what she's doing with herself. I hope she's okay, but I've never, ever forgotten all the strange and frightening things that happened that week that I stayed over at Junebug's place. Hey Joel, I've been a fan for the longest time now, and I always thought that it'd be kind of cool to send a story in. But then, since that also means some terrible and frightening thing has to happen to me, I'm always kind of glad that I don't have one worthy of submission, you know? But then after going through my grandpa's old box of keepsakes, rest in power, Grandpa, I found an old letter written by a man whose name I'd only ever heard of in passing. That of my great-great-great-grandpa, Joseph Paget. Now, I didn't know that much about him before I read the letter, and I had to have my grandma kind of confirmed what it was before I could be certain of it. But after reading through it all, I realized why my grandpa kept it around, and why he didn't take it out of its plastic wallet much, especially around us kids. And then, rather than just describe it all, I figured that I'd just type it out, word for word, and maybe see what you guys think for yourself. It was dated July 17th, 1851, to my dear friend Robert.
I must first convey my most sincere gratitude for your kind recommendation of Tremont House in the port of Galveston. The accommodations proved altogether comfortable and commodious. The excellent bottle of Chablis which you so thoughtfully procured in advance was much enjoyed, and I am given to understand that the faithful Francine continues to attend to dear Evelyn with every care during my absence. Your steadfast friendship remains among the choicest blessings which a merciful Providence has seen fit to bestow upon me in this life. Yet I regret that this might be the brightest note sounded in my present correspondence, for the tidings I bear are of the most grave and sorrowful nature. You will recall that shortly after Christmas last I received a most generous offer of employment from the governor of Texas. I informed you at the time that the position was one of medical residency, and while that statement was in itself truthful, I fear I have not been altogether candid with you. Though my secondary duty was indeed to advise and assist the physicians of San Antonio, my principal charge carried me far beyond that settled place, into regions I am certain you would have strongly counseled me to avoid, the scattered settlements of the Texas frontier. You have expressed your views upon the subject of westward expansion with such frequency and force that I may safely presume you know them to be ever present in my mind. I respect those convictions deeply. Yet I have seen with my own eyes a clear, pressing, and most urgent want of competent medical men in those distant outposts, not only for the preservation of the settlers themselves, but for the safety of us all. For in this age of steam and rail, the maladies of even our remotest neighbors may swiftly become our own. I speak chiefly of pestilence and other contagious distempers. While I fully understand the hesitation of my colleagues, I could not escape the question, if not I, then who? I arrived in San Antonio in the spring following a dire and dusty journey from the coast, and upon my arrival I was immediately struck by the brilliance of the old Spanish cathedral of San Fernando, which rises over the main plaza. Surrounding it was a curious mix of ancient adobe homes and newer, more contemporary-looking buildings, and while the streets teemed with both Tejanos and a great many European settlers, among them were a handful of soldiers and the odd Comanchero trader. Those were the men who caught my attention the most, not only for their strange manner of dress, but for the surety with which they carried themselves. They aren't natives, of course, but Tejano Spanish who forged trading arrangements with certain bands of less aggressive Comanche. They are fearsome to behold, and appear as men who've seen things of great magnificence and great terror, and I despaired to look at them. For it was the plains on which they lived, fought, traded, and died that I myself was destined for. After a night spent in lodgings much more humble than Tremont House, myself and some hired guns rode westward onto the open plains toward an isolated settlement known as Fort William. We rode for 2 days and 1 night, camping on the open prairie, and beyond the ring of older settlements, the land opened up into a vast rolling sea of grass, dotted with mesquite and prickly pear, with a horizon so wide it seems to swallow a man's very sense of scale and proportion. We made a good progress the first day, albeit beneath a fierce sun, and paused at a spring-fed creek among a small party of traveling settlers. The night was spent under the stars with a low fire, the coyotes singing their eerie chorus while we kept watch against ever-present threats. The journey tested both our horses and constitution, and the second day brought a drier country still, with the desolate distance shimmering in the heat. We rode for hours until at least the modest stockade of Fort William appeared on the plain, appearing as a lonely sentinel among a vast expanse of nothingness. I must confess to expecting something a little more professional, but what greeted us was a small and rather haphazard collection of picket walls, log huts, and adobe structures, which appeared to have been thrown up with more haste than order. A mere dozen or so families made their home there, mostly hardy frontier folk, a few soldiers and some teamsters clustered together for mutual protection against the savagery that abounds in this place. Water is drawn from a brackish creek, meat from the hunt, and news from the outer world arrives only when a rider chances through. Life is stark and unyielding,
The women tend small gardens and mind the stock, while the men work construction or stand watch. Evenings are spent around common fires with stories, hymns, and constant vigilance. The sky is immense and the winds ceaseless, and one somehow feels both the freedom and the peril of such a remote place all at once. Yet it is there that these people choose to make their home, and for that choice, they paid dearly. On the second day, a curious incident occurred that set the families on edge. As late one afternoon, a lone rider appeared far out on the prairie, moving slowly across the crest of a distant rise. At first, we took him for a welcome messenger or a lost traveler, and several men rode out a short way to hail him. But the stranger halted upon a low rise, sitting motionless upon his horse for a long while, and simply watching the fort with a stillness that carried no friendly greeting. No signal was returned, nor any approach made, and then after some minutes, he returned and rode away at an easy pace before being swallowed by the distant horizon. The fear that settled over the little community was palpable. Mothers drew children close, rifles were checked, and quiet talk of Comanche scouts or worse lingered well into the night. The next morning, tensions rose sharply when the inhabitants awoke to find dead birds deposited near the fort's walls. Doves, meadowlarks, and blackbirds were found strewn about, as though some unseen hand had cast them down in the night, and the sight unnerved the entire settlement. Some of the other frontiersmen muttered darkly that it was a deliberate warning from the Comanche, a sign that the fort was marked for destruction and that the warriors were closer than any scout had detected. Others, their faces set like cut flint, declared that they would die where they stood before they abandoned their homes and fields. Rifles were oiled with greater care that day. Children kept close to the cabins, and a heavy silence fell over the fort, broken only by the melancholic howling of prairie winds. Tensions were already high after the lone rider and the grim discovery of dead birds scattered about the fort, but on a moonless night, they rose to outright terror at a sound that came drifting on the winds. For emanating from the darkness beyond the pickets came the unmistakable sounds of a war dance. We heard drums beating low, steady rhythm that seemed to cut through our very bones, but these were nothing compared to the screeching chants of the warriors. Their war songs drifted across the prairie like the wails of tormented spirits rising and falling in eerie cadence, fierce yet mournful. The fort's families huddled together in their cabins, while the men gripped their rifles at the walls while peering into the blackness. No one slept, for every soul feared that at any moment the darkness would erupt into an onslaught. The ghostly songs continued for hours before fading into the emptiness, leaving the little fort shaken to its core, yet still they did not waver. For several days afterwards, a strange lull settled over the fort. No further riders appeared, nor war songs drifted on the nightly wind, yet the tension remained as taut as a hostile's bowstring. The fort's occupants went about their tasks, but rifles were never far from reach. Sleep came lightly, with every gust of wind or distant dust devil drawing anxious eyes to the horizon. Then one night, a loud alarm was raised when a sizable party of Comanche warriors came riding boldly toward the fort from across the prairie. The menfolk rushed to the walls, preparing for desperate battle as they loaded rifles and primed pistols. Yet to their infinite relief, the riders halted well short of range and raised a large white flag high above their heads. On the assumption they wished to parley, the fort sent out a small armed delegation of 3 men. Yet scarcely had greetings been exchanged when the trap was sprung. With a sudden and violent screech, the Comanche overwhelmed the delegation, impaling them on their war lances. Warriors then dismounted and began butchering them alive, all within plain view of the men on the fort's battlements. The effect of the delegation's screams of agony had a terrible effect on the defenders. Then, once terror had settled firmly among their ranks, the main body of the Comanche war party surged forward. They forced the gates with sheer numbers and fire, then poured inside, running amok among the cabins and corrals. What followed was a protracted and brutal struggle. Men fought hand to hand with knife, tomahawk, and clubbed rifle as the air filled with smoke and screams. Warriors attempted to drag women and children away into the plains, with several only being stopped by desperate point-blank shots or the fierce intervention of husbands and fathers wielding axes and knives. The battle raged across the dusty enclosure for what seemed an eternity, with every hut and wall becoming a separate field of combat. For a short period, I feared all was lost. But by God's mercy, the defenders prevailed at last, driving the attackers out and securing the shattered gates. But the victory came at a terrible cost. Many good men lay dead or dying, women and children were wounded, and the little fort ran red with the blood of both attacker and defender alike. I remained there for days afterwards, tending the injured as best my skills and limited supplies allowed. I set broken limbs, extracted rifle balls, and dressed cruel lacerations. I also eased the passing of those beyond earthly help using a meager supply of morphine I carried with me. The survivors now face the future with grim resolve, but the price of holding that lonely outpost upon the plains has already been dearly paid. After doing what I could for the wounded at Fort William, I moved on to another small settlement some miles further west, one that had suffered a recent attack all of its own. There I found a man lying in a darkened cabin, sorely wounded by lance and shot, yet the deepest injury of all was to his spirit, for I came to learn that his wife and young daughter had been dragged away by the Comanche during the assault. Day after day I dressed his wounds and tried to raise his spirits, but he would only turn his face to the wall and whisper that he could no longer care to live. The light had gone out of his eyes, and he seemed a man already half departed from this world, waiting only for the final summons. All of this has left me with a heavy heart and the clear conviction that a great and terrible conflict between the settlers and the Comanche is now inevitable. The hatred runs too deep, the outrages too many on both sides, and the frontier too wide and lawless for any lasting peace. I therefore mean to finish my immediate duties here and make arrangements to leave these western plains before the storm breaks in earnest and this entire region is consumed in fire and bloodshed. May God protect you, and may He in His wisdom reunite us soon. Your faithful friend and servant, Dr. Joseph Paget. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, and there are super fun live streams on Sundays and Wednesday nights. If you got a story, be sure to submit them over at my email, letsreadsubmissions@gmail.com, and you might even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks for members of the channel here on YouTube. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories and big compilations located anywhere you listen to podcasts. I also have a true crime channel called Saturn Soul. All links for everything are in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, zinc is the answer. My name's Drew, and back in the early 90s, I was a student up at Evergreen State College in Washington. It's a beautiful campus, but it was also kind of out of the way. So unless you had a car, you had to either attach yourself to someone who did, or you had to find something to do on campus in between cramming or part-time jobs or whatever you're up to. Now Josh, one of the guys I shared a class with, worked at the campus TV station. And then one day, since they were short a few people, he asked if I wanted to come over and help out for an afternoon. Now I didn't have anything better to do, and it sounded more exciting than sitting around the quad all afternoon doing nothing, and so off we went. Now, it was hard to believe that they were making actual TV shows there, but that's exactly what I watched them do, and with an impressive level of professionalism too. The week after, I asked my buddy if he needed any extra help again, and then before long, I was running the audio board for other people's shows or editing tape on those big linear editing decks that took forever for stuff to queue up. Now it was fun as hell, and I got to meet a ton of weird, cool people. Like this one guy doing a dorm room cooking show with nothing but a hot plate, Or this other guy who used to rant about the Seahawks until he was red in the face and the veins were bulging in his neck. We'd record the shows, transfer them to VHS, then after sending them off to the cable channel, we'd throw little watch parties whenever they aired. Now, it was an awesome feeling seeing it go out over the airwaves, and I immediately started thinking how cool it'd be to have something I'd made broadcast as far as Tacoma. Now, I had to wait until someone quit their slot, of course, as there weren't any free ones available. But when our Seahawks guy finally ran out of trash to talk about his team, I had an opportunity to take a slot for myself. The only question was, with what? Now, I brainstormed all kinds of ideas and briefly entertained the idea of doing comedy skits. But then, I had a brainwave. Everyone has at least some local pride, right? And the one thing everyone enjoys is a damn good mystery story. So if I planned out a show that involved investigating local mysteries and led with a story that everyone would identify with, I might actually get some eyeballs on my work. And the one local legend that got not just national, but international attention was good old Bigfoot. Now, Bigfoot was actually a personal interest of mine, just not in the way you think. I was a believer once, and after moving to the Pacific Northwest, I read On the Track of the Sasquatch and The Apes Among Us by John Green, as well as The Bigfoot Casebook by Janet and Colin Board. The Apes Among Us is a particularly fascinating read, and Green is very passionate about the subject. There's just one problem. I don't believe a word of it anymore. Logically speaking, we'd have probably found Bigfoot's skeleton by now, and I'm not just talking about Peter Kane dog trainer, as while there are a plethora of other reasons why the Bigfoot myth is just that, a myth, the biggest debunker is the issue of the remains. But what I'd never personally seen is anyone putting those reasons to a true believer, one who'd actually done the research on it themselves, and if done respectfully and amicably, I figured I might have cracked the formula to some pretty great television. Now, I managed to find a guy who ran a guided Bigfoot tour that included a night of camping in areas where there had been plenty of sightings, apparently. Now, I'm guessing the camping alone gave the guests a spooky enough atmosphere when all they were really doing was hanging out and having fun together with some like-minded people. Now, I get it, man, I do. It's fun to have friends and tell spooky stories, but I wanted to know if what the guide was saying stood up to any scrutiny. And not in a mean, you're a liar, mister kind of way, more like as a way of exploring the veracity of the subject in a way that didn't sensationalize it, and asking all the questions folks at home wanted to ask on their behalf. Now, I didn't think that'd be an attractive prospect, but luckily, Brandon, the tour guide, actually agreed to it. Now, Brandon was a real character. He was warm, friendly, and immediately saw my offer as an opportunity to promote his business. He said he didn't mind if I had questions because he'd been answering them for the better part of 20 years. And as long as I didn't try making him look stupid in front of the other folks on the tour, I was welcome to ask anything I wanted. Now, my buddy Josh and I went out to meet him one weekend to shoot some opening footage that had run before that of the actual tour. Brandon looked like I imagined him. Flannel shirt, jeans, big mustache, and beer gut. Now, he was also so excited to be on a TV show, even if it was just public access, that he made for a fantastic interviewee. By the time we were done with the segment, I was actually psyched to go on the tour with him, if only for the fact it'd be fun to hang out with him overnight in the woods. And even if I didn't get to debunk the whole Bigfoot thing, and in the space of a half-hour cable access show, it'd still make for great viewing. And when the Saturday of the tour rolled around, me and Josh drove out to where Brandon was based. We borrowed a car and one of the station's crappy camcorders, and then once all of Brandon's tourists were assembled, we hit the trails, and it wasn't long before my questions began. When Brandon talked about eyewitness sightings, I brought up how unreliable they were. Then when he brought up tracks and footprints, I brought up how the famous Patterson-Gimlin tracks were eventually proven to be a hoax. I kept it friendly. There was no gotcha moments, and the other guests actually enjoyed us talking about Native American references to megafauna. And we agreed, and quite excitedly too, that modern technology brought us all closer to a definitive truth, but at least one of the other guests did not appreciate our approach. There was this older guy who looked to be in his late 40s, jean shorts, hoodie, ball cap, shades. Now, he'd been quiet for almost all of the hike, but his facial expressions and body language were getting louder and louder. Then when me and Brandon started discussing Bigfoot population numbers, he boiled over completely. Brandon made the point that animals which adapt to colder climates generally exist in low numbers, like in the case of polar bears or certain kinds of whales. It was a pretty solid retort to my point that an ape the size of Bigfoot would need a large population to avoid inbreeding. But when I circled back around to the point about calorie consumption, as Bigfoots would have to eat crazy amounts of food and would therefore leave a crazy amount of poop, I imagine, the guy with the ball cap and shades turned around and got right up in my face. The man that I'll only refer to as Angry Dave was all red and puffed up, asking what my problem was, and saying that a Bigfoot tour wasn't some place for some close-minded college kid. I tried telling him I wasn't close-minded, that I'd read a bunch of literature on the topic and I wanted nothing but the truth. But Dave replied that I knew nothing about the woods or real life and accused me of trying to ruin the tour for everyone else just so I could feel like a smarty party. Now I get why he was mad, and Josh had already suggested how joining an actual tour might lead to something like that. Brandon had insisted that we do just that, probably because the presence of a TV camera made him look all newsworthy or whatever. And I guess he felt his share of the blame too, because he stepped in fast to say, "It's okay, I invited the guy," offering a more private tour at Angry Dave's convenience. But Dave didn't want to hear it. He stepped closer, got louder, and even looked like he was about to swing for me at one point. Between myself, Josh, and Brandon, we managed to calm him down enough to continue the tour, with Dave doing nothing but glaring at me every time I spoke. Now, I kept the questions to an absolute minimum following the confrontation, as in addition to the nighttime stuff we were about to shoot, Josh and I had more than enough footage to put together a 30-minute segment. Now, once we had all of our tents set up, Brandon had got a little campfire going and conversations moved away from Bigfoot, and the tension started to lift. Even Angry Dave started to lighten up a little, even if he did roll his eyes or shake his head at pretty much anything me or Josh came on with. Now, after we all retired to our tents, Josh and I shot a little more footage, basically saying that we'd started shooting again if we heard any creepy noises. Now, we didn't expect to hear any. In fact, I was convinced that if we did hear any noises, it'd be Brandon out there faking them to play a friendly prank on the skeptics. But as it turned out, on that point, I was dead wrong. I was pretty tired from all the walking, and me and Josh had to get up super early that morning to check our gear. So once we shot our tent footage and lay down in our bedrolls, I don't think either of us lasted even a minute before we were dead to the world. I guess we were out around 3 hours or so, because the next thing I know, Josh is shaking me awake at like 1 a.m. while whispering, Dude, listen." We stayed quiet for a second, and then I suddenly heard this loud, sharp thwacking sound in the distance, like someone was hitting the trunk of a tree with a large branch. It might sound strange, but it was such a clearly identifiable sound, but it was also one with some very sinister connotations. Now, for those of you that don't know, Bigfoot is supposed to hit trees with sticks as a form of communication. Some say it's how Bigfoots talk to each other, and it is Bigfoots, not big feet, but others say that they're a warning to humans, and the people who've ignored these warnings have then mysteriously gone missing. Now, I didn't think it was Bigfoot at all. I thought it was Brandon. But when we got out of the tent with the camera, I saw Brandon and another tourist standing there all wide-eyed and looking spooked. I guess it was sort of a nervous reaction on my part, but I whispered a joke to Brandon about how I figured the noise would be him trying to play a prank on us. I thought he might see the funny side, but he didn't. He just shook his head like he well and truly believed it was Bigfoot out there, and then shushed us so we could keep on listening to those spaced out thwacking sounds. Now, Brandon had already explained what we were hearing during the tour, so as all the other tourists got out their tents to join us, each of them had that same look of fear and wonder on their faces. I started whispering to the camera to explain the sounds, and then out of nowhere, we all heard this blood-curdling scream from off in the distance, about the same distance the dull thwacks were coming from. Everyone's like, "Oh my God," and even Brandon looked terrified. And I won't lie, Josh and I got pretty spooked too, and I remember thinking it was some type of prank, and then it was a damn good one. But then, one of the other tourists realized that Angry Dave's tent was empty, and I watched Brandon's head just spin around, terrified. He asked if anyone had seen or heard him, and one of the others said that they'd woken up to hear him walking off somewhere like he went to pee, but evidently he hadn't returned. Someone else then asked if Dave might have gone looking for the source of the sound, and since that scream sounded like it came from a man of Dave's age and size, Brandon went into full-on crisis mode, thinking that this guy was hurt. Now he grabbed his flashlight and then went tearing off into the woods, yelling Dave's name. The rest of us followed like we were programmed to, with the tourists close behind, and Josh and I at the rear with the camera. We ran for about a minute or two, all yelling out Dave's name, and when Brandon stopped, we stopped too. He asked us to fan out and look around, as Dave might be so hurt that he actually couldn't respond. Now, one of the other tourists then asked if he thought that Bigfoot had outright killed Dave and might have dragged him off someplace after attacking him, but Brandon said he didn't know, and it was like that answer made things worse for everyone. They wanted him to have answers, so when he didn't, it frightened everyone all the more. Now, I didn't think we were about to encounter a Bigfoot. I thought Dave had walked off and taken some tumble in the dark, or worse, maybe gotten himself attacked by an animal or something. Now, just because he hadn't been attacked by some mythical creature didn't mean that he wasn't in danger, and the same applied to us, too. Walking through those dark woods was seriously scary, and it's crazy how much fear can make you doubt yourself. And by that, I mean I was scared that I actually started wondering if I was about to be proved wrong about Bigfoot, and in spectacularly horrifying fashion. I didn't fully start to believe or anything. I just struggled to compute how nightmarishly ironic it'd be if I was torn apart by something I didn't even believe existed. Brandon had his gun with him, but no one else was armed, so I had to go walking through the dark forest with nothing but a big stick in my hand and a camera in Josh's. The whole time I'm yelling Dave's name, asking him to call out to us to let us know where he is. But I'm also spinning on the spot to face every little noise, like I was expecting Bigfoot to come rushing out of the darkness into our flashlight beams before picking us up and bashing us against the trees. I had my head on a swivel, and Josh had to do everything in his power to keep a steady shot, and he still couldn't keep his hands from shaking. But when it came too quickly for either of us to do anything about it, and I barely even saw that giant stick before it smashed into my head. I went down like a ton of bricks, while Josh was so startled by the sudden presence that he fell back on his butt and dropped the camera. But even if he hadn't, and he kept on filming as that stick smashed into my ribs, and then hips, and then legs, he wouldn't have recorded me getting attacked by a Bigfoot, because the only person attacking me was Angry Dave. Mine and Josh's yelling attracted the attention of the others, and to his absolute credit, it was Brandon who showed up seconds later with his gun drawn, telling Dave to put the stick down or he'd shoot. Now, I guess there's no love lost between me and Dave at this point, but while I appreciate that some of you might think I'm exaggerating to make him look bad, I'm definitely not. And so when I say he looked so out of his mind with rage that it appeared that he might charge at Brandon at any second, I'm not just saying that. And for a moment or two, I was legitimately scared that I was about to watch him get his head blown off. He looked at Brandon, then down at me like he wanted to just keep on hitting me. But right as he raised the stick up again, Brandon yelled out that he'd shoot if he hit me again. And that sort of brought Dave back to reality, I guess. He stepped back, dropping the stick while still red as a beet. Then I guess when he realized what he'd done and how we might have had it all on camera, we didn't, Dave turned and went running back to the camp to grab his stuff. He left just as hastily as Brandon and the other tourists yelled at him, saying the cops would be informed. I remember feeling a little smug, knowing that he'd given me all the ammo I needed to get his ass thrown in jail. but he hit me so hard that I had blood running down from my hairline, and it hurt so bad that I knew I needed to get to a hospital right away. Dave had obviously faked all the stick sounds and the scream, and according to the cops, his original intention was only to scare me. But when he saw me and Josh with our camera, especially me being lit up like a freaking Christmas tree, the red mist descended, and he attacked me with the same stick that he'd been using to hit that tree. He ended up spending about 6 months inside, which was better than nothing, I guess, whereas I got myself a nice little hairline scar as a souvenir. It sucked having to get stitches and stuff, and for a while, the doctors were worried that I'd have a pretty bad concussion. But to me, the worst thing was that Brandon revoked his permission for us to air the footage. He'd already signed a waiver, but Josh and I didn't much feel like going to war with him over it, so to speak, and he'd been so nice and welcoming it wasn't his fault that he accidentally brought along some fanatical psycho. Airing the footage would have the opposite effect on his business, so when he coupled his revocation with a polite request, I couldn't find it in myself to just ignore it. I guess that's about the end of the story, though. But don't worry, I'm not going to try and end on some poignant line about lessons learned, because I think the lessons here are obvious to all who wish to learn them. So, my mom was originally from Russia, and she lived up there during the Soviet years, but she never really talked about it while I was growing up. I learned this was because you could divide Soviet immigrants into one of two categories: those who talked about their old lives back in the USSR, and those who didn't. And those who talked tended to complain about it, saying things like, "We had equality for all, equally empty shelves and equally long lines." Or my personal favorite, "The future was bright, the present was gray, and the past was whatever the party said it was." But those who didn't talk about it, you learn not to pry. Some people escaped communism with nothing but nightmares and the clothes on their back. And thankfully, while nothing too terrible ever happened to Mom, she had a few stories of her own. Now, back when she was still a student, Mom volunteered to work at a pioneer camp for the summer, which was exactly the same as an American summer camp in almost every way. She was a guardian there, which is basically what they called their counselors, and in addition to all the games, activities, and fresh air, guardians served up generous doses of Soviet propaganda. Mom said the camps were like paradise on the surface, but in this one place, beneath the smiles and the slogans, there was a kind of tension in the air. From what she could gather, the head guardian had been selected by this one committee. Almost everything in Russia at that time was run by committee, so the decision of the guardian appointing committee had to be ratified by this other committee. Now, once their approval had been secured, the head guardian was approved. But then the head of the other committee suddenly changed his mind because his spoiled, bratty-ass son wanted to be head guardian. Now, the guy goes about trying to reverse the decision, first by bureaucracy, but when that failed, he turned to threats. No one threatened the head guardian, not directly anyway, but there was talk of having him removed, even closing the camp down completely. Mom said this went on for like 2 weeks, getting a slow drip of information, partly fact and partly rumor. And then one day, the head guardian announced the whole thing was over. A decision had come down from on high, guaranteeing his place at the camp for the next couple of years, and since the guy was a pretty beloved figure, everyone was happy about it. Every person except one. Mom said a few nights later, after all the kids had been put to bed, she was doing her rounds on the second floor of a dorm. She remembered checking in on this one group when suddenly this deep feeling of unease came over her. Russia's a place of extremes. Super cold in the winter, but then depending where you're at, it can get super hot during the summer. Now that night was no different, so the air in all the dorms was very warm. But in that one, the air felt just like a little too warm in places. And then suddenly, she started to smell the smoke. She could tell right away it wasn't just campfire smoke, a smell she was very familiar with by then because the smoke that night had an artificial, chemical sort of scent to it. Then, when she ran to the window and saw flames licking up the walls from the ground floor, she realized fire was spreading fast. So Mom hit the dorm's alarm, and in doing so, unleashed total chaos. The alarm scared the kids half to death, so they were almost blind with panic as they came tearing out of their rooms. Things would have been way worse if Mom and some other guardians weren't bunked in the same building and they were able to restore a little order once they came out of their rooms. But then when a guardian discovered the stairwells were full of smoke, they realized that to escape, they had no choice but to basically throw the kids from the second-floor windows, and they had to do it fast. Smoke was building up, people were coughing, and as the kids were starting to panic. Mom said that at first some of the older ones tried to help the little ones, but it wasn't long until panic took over and the guardians lost control. And then not only did she watch kids literally climbing over each other, but kids as young as 6 or 7 were pushing open the windows and then just leaping out into the dark before hitting the ground with these sickening thuds. Now, it was only the second floor, so the kids who jumped didn't get hurt too bad. But they were landing on concrete, so Mom said it was still pretty horrifying to hear their thuds as they landed awkwardly, followed by their screams of pain as they broke bones or sprained ankles. And outside on the ground, camp guardians were running around with buckets of water doing anything they could to at least slow the spread, but Mom said those buckets were all but useless against those flames. More adults poured out into the scene from the staff quarters while Mom kept on herding the kids towards the windows. One little disabled girl she was carrying went limp in her arms from the smoke, and Mom had to fight through the crowd to get her to a window. She said things were starting to look really bad, but right when the kids needed to, the bus showed up. The camp's groundskeeper, this big burly guy whose name was Grigor, ended up driving the camp's bus right up to the burning dorm, so it was running lengthways alongside it. It meant the kids had something to break their fall while jumping from the corridor windows, of which there were many. So as soon as the guardians realized what was happening, they told the kids to jump, and they came pouring out to land on top of the bus. Guardians were on the ground too, helping them down when they landed. Some of the kids hit the bus pretty hard and got hurt that way too, but even the ones who bounced or fell had something there to catch them. Mom said that Grigor's quick thinking saved dozens of lives, her own included. And then once the last few kids had jumped on top of the bus, Mom and another guardian jumped too, and just in the nick of time, because Mom said that once she had her feet on solid ground, she turned to see the bus was starting to catch fire itself. By dawn, the dorm building was a soaking wet ruin. It took the fire department a while to make it out there, so by the time they arrived, the dorm was pretty much done for. Their trucks were still there by sunup, as were the medics treating injured kids, and the worst of which were laid out on blankets not far from the ruins of their dorm. Parents started showing up worried not long after because you could see the smoke for miles around. But here's where things started getting even darker, because a lot of those parents showed up to a police perimeter with cops telling them to go home and wait for news there. Mom said they wanted to control the flow of information coming in and out, so they showed up fast to stop panic from spreading. Mom helped with the cleanup and then helped set up makeshift hospital tents. But as she worked, she found herself fixated on this one little detail she'd overlooked that previous night. When she ran to the windows and saw the fire for the first time, she remembered seeing someone running for the tree line off in the distance, but then seeing the flames sent her into action, so the image of that figure running off didn't return until later. But even then, it was pretty obvious the fire was no accident. The firefighters found signs of gas or some flammable liquid, which explained the chemical smell Mom had caught early on, and then once it became clear it was arson, the police took over completely. Mom said it was obvious who did it and that the only person with any ill will against the camp was the son of that committee head, who was bitter about not getting his way. And so when the police announced that they'd found the arsonist and that it had been some hermit living a few miles away in the woods, everyone was very surprised. No one even knew that the guy had been living out there, not in all the time the camp had been running, so he'd obviously kept to himself. And then when they said they caught him with a ton of stolen gas cans, the kind used at the camp depot, things made even less sense. We hadn't noticed any fuel going missing, and why would a hermit steal gas if he didn't have anything that ran on it? But as was custom back then, when authorities spoke, people didn't talk back. The hermit was just a raggedy old loner with no one to speak up for him, and so to authorities, it was an open and shut case. They hauled him in, gave him a closed-door trial, and then announced he was going to be executed for 50 counts of attempted murder, with the aggravating factors being that his target was a dorm full of little kids. Not even a month went by. That poor hermit was executed, and then all these bigwigs went around patting themselves on the back, telling everyone that children were safe again. But Mom said that's just what they wanted them to think. The Guardian started hearing rumors about the hermit. Stuff like how he was half blind, could barely walk straight most days. How does a guy like that sneak into a guarded camp, set the dorm on fire, and then run off before anyone could apprehend him? He doesn't, because whoever really set the dorm on fire was running at full speed when my mom saw them, meaning that they were young, fit, and healthy, and not some old hermit. And the cover-up stank, and Mom said the mood got so bad that party officials came around to the camp to personally remind the Guardians that spreading false rumors meant losing their jobs or worse. Mom kept her mouth shut and her head down, but said that inside, she was boiling. After the camp closed for the season, Mom went back to her regular life, but the anger and the nightmares both stuck around. The kids mostly recovered. A few had scars from burns or falls, but all were traumatized by what they went through. Mom carried her own scars too, mental ones, in the form of the knowledge that sometimes justice gets buried under politics. Before she moved to America and once the Soviet Union started collapsing, Mom thought about digging into it more, maybe finding old records or talking to other survivors. She'd always believed it was the committee's head kid who lit the fire and that the hermit was just a convenient scapegoat. Some poor soul who made the perfect patsy, whose secret trial ensured nobody could ask any serious questions in open court. Hearing her tell it like that hit me hard. This wasn't just some story in a book that we read in history class. It was my mom's life, something she lived through and that shaped her into the tough, no-nonsense woman she was. She always made sure that I knew the value of speaking up, even when it might seem scary, because, as she so correctly said, staying quiet lets the bad people get away with things. Many years ago, I got home from work to find my girlfriend, now wife, having dinner in front of the TV. We talked about our days as I made myself some coffee, and then suddenly, the news guy said something about a murder that had taken place close by. A local man had been found dead in his home, having been stabbed just shy of 100 times. The sheer number of wounds had us thinking, Jesus Christ, that poor man. And it was very shocking to have something like that happen in the quiet, relatively crime-free area we lived in. But then they flashed the victim's picture on screen, and as I looked at him and heard his name, I felt the color and blood drain from my face. When my girlfriend asked if I knew the guy, I nodded. I said his name was Ryan. Now, it's not his real name, and he was a counselor at a summer camp that I went to as a child. Now, she knew that I'd been to a camp as a kid, but I'd never told her the story of Ryan and how much he'd affected my life one summer back when I was a child. And then over the next hour or so, I laid it all out for her. And this, in so many words, is what I said. When I was 11 years old, Mom and Dad decided that I was going to summer camp again that year. We moved across the country not long before, so while I wasn't psyched about going to a new place, I was way past the tantrums and I don't want to go phase of my life. And they showed me some pamphlets for this place called Camp Choctaw. Now, it's not its real name, but I thought it sounded cool. And the kids looked like they were having some huge amounts of fun, and the theme was all things Native American, with plenty of archery, making teepees, and weaving dream catchers. During the final week, the camp held a big powwow where all the kids got to make their own headdresses, and the counselors cooked on a barbecue instead of in the cafeteria. I thought it looked awesome, and while making new friends was always nerve-wracking, I was stoked to be heading to Camp Choctaw for a month come summertime. The camp was in a giant clearing out in the middle of the woods with these cool log-style cabins with big porches scattered around. A big open pavilion thing sat in the middle with picnic tables, and further back I could see the cafeteria and what looked like some sort of activities lodge. Now there were also a couple of brightly colored teepees set up near the pavilion, but we were told that they were just a display piece and that no one got to sleep in them. Now that didn't matter to me though. But even without getting to sleep in an actual teepee like a Native American, the place looked awesome. There were already tons of kids running around by the time me and my dad showed up. I could see the counselors too, mostly college-aged guys, but a couple of older men also. And apart from the cook, who seemed kinda grouchy, they all seemed like really fun dudes. All the younger guys were wearing bandanas or beads and stuff like that, and I remember this blonde dude came over to my dad's car with this big smile like, "Hey buddy, you ready for the best week ever?" Then as we're getting out of the car, he asked, "What's your name?" "My name's Ryan." That was my first meeting with him, and never in a million years did I imagine things would end the way they did. But life is strange sometimes like that, I guess. Now, after I said goodbye to my dad, I joined the other kids, and then eventually I heard my name being called by one of the counselors. I joined a big group of boys and being herded over towards the main lodge where the head counselor, a taller, older man, told us that we were all in cabin 4, and that our group name was the Wolves. Now, we followed him down this little path through the trees where we were met by an awesome log cabin with a big wooden wolf carved over the door. Now, it smelled like bug spray and cleaning fluid. And then as we all piled in and started picking bunks, I remember this skinny kid with messy brown hair and a dinosaur shirt coming up to me and asking if he can take the one above mine. Now, I told him, "Sure, dude," trying to sound nonchalant even though I was pretty nervous. And then over the next half hour or so, we got to know each other a little. Now, by the time the counselor came in to give us a little orientation speech, Tommy and I were already sitting on the floor together, sharing snacks while laughing about how this one kid looked like a burrito when all zipped up in a sleeping bag. Now, that first night, we all stayed up way too late, planning out all the cool stuff we were going to do in these whispers. And then for the next 3 weeks or so, Tommy and I became best friends. Now, whether it was making clay pots, being partners in 3-legged races, or finding sneaky ways to help ourselves to some extra s'mores, Tommy and I did it together. It felt like it was going to be the best summer of my whole life, and that me and Tommy were going to be best buddies till the day we died. And then one day, about midway through the second week, I woke up in the middle of the night to find Tommy gone from his bunk. I needed to use the bathroom, really bad too, so my first thought after my eyes opened was bathroom. But as I got up, that's when I noticed Tommy's bunk was empty. I figured he'd also gone to take a leak, so I walked out of the cabin thinking that I'd bump into him or see him on the way or whatever. But on the walk to the bathroom, I didn't see Tommy, and neither was he in the bathroom when I walked inside there. Now I'm thinking, that's weird. And then after taking a whiz and washing up, I walked out into the night again to sort of yell whisper Tommy's name like, "Tommy! Tommy!" At first, there was nothing but silence, and so I kept going towards the pavilion near where the teepees were and kept on calling out for Tommy. Now, it felt creepy as hell being out there all alone after dark, then right as I'm thinking I should maybe just go back to my dorm, I hear this low, eerie whine, almost like an animal, but different. It sent literal chills through me, and while I somehow managed to keep quiet, I sprinted back to my cabin and jumped in my bunk, waking everyone up in my cabin in the process and severely pissing them off. They asked me what was wrong, but when I said, "There's something out there," they listened for just a second before being like, "No, there isn't, dumbass. Go back to sleep." Now, it might sound weird, but being shamed like that actually did calm me down. If my cabin mates weren't freaked out, then it was most likely just my imagination getting the better of me. I also realized I was scared Tommy was headed home early for some reason, like he'd gone off to the nurse with some illness in the middle of the night and was on his way to the hospital or something with me none the wiser. But then in the morning, and much to my relief, there was Tommy, lying in his bunk like the previous night's strangeness was nothing but a weird dream. I was majorly relieved to see him, but since the other kids had also noticed he was missing, it wasn't just me who wanted to know where he'd gone. But when asked, Tommy told us that he'd gone over to the counselor's bathroom for a dump, instead of using the gross one that we all shared. I didn't just buy it. It was like, that boy's a genius, because that shared outhouse thing was nasty as hell. But after we were all done being like, the hell didn't we think of that? I told Tommy about the weird noise that I heard outside. I said it sounded like an animal, but that it also had this kind of creepy familiarity to it. And Tommy just looked at me blankly for a second and then said that he hadn't heard anything during the walk to the counselor's place, or on the way back again. But then, and I know this might sound weird, I couldn't tell if he was serious or not. Tommy had pulled a few pranks on me over the previous few weeks, enough that I got an idea when he was lying or not, and when he told me that he didn't hear anything, he couldn't hold eye contact. And I asked him once if he was sure, and then when he insisted, I changed the subject and jokingly suggested that there was a vampire or werewolf running around camp after dark. Tommy played along and laughed, but something just felt off. I figured maybe he was tired and hoped that he wasn't coming down with something that would result in him going home early. We kind of dawdled behind as we're talking, with all the other kids filing past us on their way to breakfast. And then just after I cracked the joke about the vampires or werewolves, a counselor I called Todd came over to usher us along. Now Todd was friendly enough, but you know when you just sort of get a bad feeling about someone when you're a kid? Yeah, that. He just seemed kind of fake, like he was always right on the cusp of his patience wearing thin, at which point he'd drop the cool counselor act and revert to his natural douchebag-like state. Now he came over saying, "Hey guys, everything alright?" But before I could even answer, Tommy was making a beeline for the cafeteria. Now I remember thinking, dude, wait up, in my head, but while I didn't strictly like Counselor Todd, I couldn't exactly just go walking off without answering him. So I was kind of glued to the spot thinking, damn it, now I gotta talk to him. I basically lied and told him everything was fine, and then he told me to catch up with the others. But then as I'm walking off, Todd asked if I needed someone to take me to the bathroom. I was 11, dude, not like 4. No one had asked me if I wanted them to take me to the bathroom since I was back in diapers. But again, this dude's an authority figure, so I'm not rude to him. I'm just thinking, no thanks, Todd, I'm good. I was actually kind of mad when I caught up with Tommy. I mean, not like mad, but I was still saying, dude, why the hell did you just leave me with that weirdo? He told me he was hungry and just wanted to get to the cafeteria, but I could tell that wasn't it. I got so frustrated that I asked him pretty loudly what the hell had gotten into him, only to be immediately warned by one of the counselors to keep my cool. I ended up apologizing to Tommy after breakfast, saying I didn't mean to yell at him, but that's when he offered his own apology and told me how I was kinda right. Something was bothering him, so much it was making him feel sick, so sick that he didn't want to eat. And it was true, all he'd done was push his food around on his plate, and this was after telling me he was so hungry he abandoned me to Todd. But when it came to telling me exactly what was bothering him, Tommy wouldn't say. I had to assume it was some kind of medical thing, because why the hell else would he just be going to call his mom and dad and ask if they'd come get him the next morning? I practically begged him not to go, and to wait and see how he felt later that day. But Tommy was adamant. He felt awful and he needed to go home. I was devastated, but after going through the stages of grief over the course of about an hour, I just landed on acceptance. I put on a happy face and then tried to make sure Tommy's final day at camp was a good one. And while I was kind of successful in that front, the rest of that day was still kind of awkward. Tommy never did get his spark back. He was just too preoccupied with something, and I figured it was my job to just be a good friend and distract from it as best I could. But since Tommy was down, I was down too, so it wasn't long before Counselor Ryan, the guy who first greeted me when I arrived at the camp, came over to see what was up. Ryan was pretty much everyone's favorite counselor and had this total big brother vibe about him. He was good at sports, definitely had that jock feel about him, but at the same time he was warm, approachable, and made sure no one felt left out or ignored. I really looked up to the guy, so when he came around and asked if everything with me and Tommy was okay, he'd also seen me yelling at Tommy, I basically poured my heart out. I said he was acting weird, that he wanted to go home and that something was bothering him, but he wouldn't tell me what. Ryan then gave me what could have been a movie monologue saying I was a good friend. Tommy was lucky to have me and that everything would turn out just fine if I acted with integrity and always told the truth. Now, 11-year-old me ate that up, especially coming from Ryan, and then the rest of the days seemed that little bit brighter. And like I said, Tommy was much quieter than usual, so after dinner there was no staying up late and whispering between bunks. But then for a second night in a row, when I woke up in the middle of the night to go take a pee, Tommy was not in his bunk. Now that time I knew that I wouldn't see him on the way to the bathroom. That's not where he was going, but as I was creeping through the darkness outside, calling out Tommy's name somewhere between a yell and a whisper, I heard that skin-crawling, high-pitched whine again. It scared the hell out of me, but I didn't run that time. I stayed silent and still, waited to hear it again, and then realized it was coming from the teepees near the pavilion. I crept towards them, then heard the whining sound a third time, only on that occasion I heard a grown man say something like, "Shush." It was definitely coming from inside one of the teepees, and although I was scared out of my mind, my desire to help Tommy spurred me forward. I almost wasn't surprised to see him when I opened up that teepee, but I was surprised to see Counselor Todd in there with him, and I was especially surprised to see Todd standing there, wearing nothing but socks. I was so shocked I dropped the tent flap, and then went running off towards the counselor's cabins, only to find that none other than Counselor Ryan was headed towards me. You can imagine how relieved I was to see him, right? How he might as well have been Superman walking over to save the day. Well, imagine that feeling and double it. When he asked me what was wrong, I told him Tommy and Counselor Todd were in the teepee together, and at first Ryan was just like, "Okay, and?" But then I was obviously like, Todd is naked in there. But instead of being horrified or even asking me to clarify what I'd said because he couldn't believe his ears, Ryan just said, "That's cool, buddy. Me and you can go have some grown-up fun too if you want." I'd never smelled alcohol in anyone's breath before. Not like I did then, anyway. My dad only ever drank beer, and only after me and my sister had gone to bed. But even today, that smell brings me back to that dark night at Camp Choctaw, and the horror I felt after Counselor Ryan asked me to join him. It was me who couldn't believe what I'd just heard. Not just because of what it entailed, but because I'd never had anyone talk to me like that before. All I could do was stand there, dumbstruck with horror, until Ryan reached out and tried to take me by the arm. And that's when my soul returned to my body, I guess, and his touch had me recoiling like his fingers were made of hot coals. I couldn't bring myself to scream. I don't know why, but I just couldn't. I felt like I was in a dream. I didn't want people to know what had happened, and I mean, not at first anyway. So I just ran back to my bunk, curled up against my sleeping bag, and just laid there for hours. Trapped in this waking nightmare of reliving what happened over and over in my head. And by the time morning rolled around and the head counselor came over to speak with me about that previous night, I couldn't bring myself to talk about it. I couldn't even look at Tommy, who by then had walked past me with his bag towards the counselor's building, where he was due to be picked up by his parents. And I couldn't bring myself to look at Counselor Ryan either, not as the head said he heard that I had a bad dream. I just nodded along. Yeah, sorry for scaring everybody. And it was twice as horrific because I suddenly found myself where Tommy was, or still was, trapped in this cage of not being able to talk about it for what were a bunch of different reasons. Fear, shame, disgust, you name it. I then did the same thing as Tommy and lied that I was feeling so sick that I needed my parents. And I had to wait until the afternoon for Dad to get there, but he didn't need much convincing when I talked to him over the phone. I guess he could hear it in my voice. That fear and shame and disgust that I mentioned. Fathers know their sons like that, then almost as soon as we're on the highway and Camp Choctaw was in the rear window, I broke down crying. Telling my mom and dad about what happened was easier than I thought it would be, I guess because of that safety I felt. But the thing that had me bursting into tears over and over was the thought of Tommy having to tell his parents what happened, because he was obviously in a way worse situation. Now, we had swapped phone numbers long before we both left camp, so I was able to give Tommy's number to my father, and he contacted Tommy's parents immediately, and I remember feeling as if everything was going to be fine. Dad was going to fix everything, and in that omnipotent parental way that seems like magic to kids who don't know how the world works yet. I remember Mom hugging me, and the mute sound of Dad's voice while he talked on the phone in his office. He was in there for a while, but when he came out, I figured everything had been fixed. But I was wrong. Dad came back into my bedroom and in so many words asked me, tactfully, if I made the whole thing up. He didn't outright accuse me of lying because I think he knew that I believed something had happened to Tommy, but when he put the same thing to Tommy's parents and they asked their son, he denied everything. I couldn't believe it at the time. And now it makes all the sense in the world to me, but in the moment, I couldn't understand why Tommy would be cool with the counselors not being punished for what they did to him. I tried telling my dad that it was Tommy who was lying, which made everything all the worse because it was like me versus him by that point. I knew he'd hate me for trying to tell the truth when all he wanted to do was move on and pretend it never happened, but I couldn't just stay quiet. Sometimes I wonder if I should have just moved on and forgotten about it instead of turning a whole year of my life into this slow nightmare with no end in sight. But as they used to say to knights back in the day, always tell the truth, even if it leads to your death. At least that's what I tell myself to keep the doubt and regret at bay. Dad didn't give up. He and Mom believed me, and they even said years later that what Tommy and his parents said didn't wash. They said it was that classic sort of victim in denial thing, whereas I was able to talk about it because I hadn't actually been violated. Dad was the one who adopted the whole thing as like his own personal cause, one he'd fight to the bitter end. And while that might sound like a nice thing to say, the reality of that bitter end left an even more bitter taste. Regardless of whether Tommy was going to tell the truth or not, Dad got in touch with the cops and relayed everything I'd said to them. That kicked off this whole investigation side of things, and I had to go talk to some police lady for hours in some cozy, colorful family room, which was supposed to make me feel safe and comfortable. Well, it didn't work, and I had a major panic attack when I got to the part where Ryan made a move on me. I only cried when I described seeing Tommy in the teepee with Todd. It made me feel sick to my stomach, but I was able to talk about it with her. But then once I got to the Ryan part, it was like I was right there again, standing in the dark and smelling the booze on his breath, and all I wanted to do was run. When it was all over, I'd given my statement in full. Everyone kept telling me how brave I'd been and how everything was going to be just fine. But, and just like with Ryan's little movie monologue speech, that was a lie too. I didn't know what was coming, and no one took the time to warn me either, I guess because how the hell do you even explain a thing like that to an 11-year-old? Sit them down and say, oh, by the way, no one's going to believe you and there's going to be a huge campaign to make us out to be crazy liars to try and scam a summer camp out of their hard-earned cash. Nah, they wouldn't understand, and so no one tried. The first I heard of any pushback, Dad was screaming at Mom in the kitchen one day when I got home from my friends. Their mom gave me a ride, and when I walked inside, I thought Dad was mad at Mom for some reason, but he wasn't. He was mad at something he read in the paper. According to some reporter, Camp Choctaw had conducted a full and thorough investigation of their counselor's conduct, and had concluded that no wrongdoing whatsoever had taken place. They welcomed any kind of police investigation and claimed they'd fully cooperate. But when push came to shove, there just wasn't enough evidence or testimony without Tommy. And the more my dad pushed them to change their mind, the harder they pushed back. Then in the end, the cops said if he didn't leave them alone, he'd be charged with harassment. We had to basically hold out hope that Tommy was going to change his mind, tell the truth, and allow us to bring both a lawsuit against Camp Choctaw and charges against its counselors. But while we're waiting, the wave of negative stories hit. Someone wrote into one of the papers claiming to be a relative of an accused counselor and basically saying we were liars trying to extort Camp Choctaw. The story even made it on the air when some talk show host ran a phone-in about it. Some people fought in our corner, saying the police ought to do more to encourage victims to come forward, but others said all kinds of crazy stuff about us, like how my dad had only taken a dislike to Camp Choctaw because it revered native culture and taught respect for those that came before. I cannot overemphasize what complete nonsense that was, and I also can't overemphasize how furious it made my dad. But not just furious either. He got legitimately depressed over it. He drank more, he took time off of work because of the stress, and it was a terrible time for everyone involved, but I guess none more so than Tommy. He ended up moving out of state with his family. We got no warning. Me and him never spoke again after we climbed into our bunks on that last night of camp. And we heard it through the newspaper when someone wrote about how the silent witness, as they called him, had moved on for good. My family ended up moving too, mostly because Dad had his reputation absolutely shredded in the media, with a pretty prominent columnist calling him a racist who'd ruin his own son's life in the hopes of lining his pockets. He's had a personal prejudice against reporters ever since, at least certain kinds, and to be honest, I can't blame him either. If the media had taken our side, things might have ended up way different. I think that's what would have pushed Tommy to make the right decision and made sure the people that hurt him got what's coming to them. But whatever chance he had of changing his mind will have been snuffed out the first time he heard about the counter-accusations, saying how we were being coached by our parents